I'm not posting this for thrills. I'm posting it because I learned the rules the hard way and I don't want you learning them the same way. If you take the unpaved road out along the rim at Angel Peak Scenic Area off US 550 near Bloomfield, New Mexico, and you plan to stay past dark, bring another vehicle and park nose out. My spouse and I didn't break any laws or mess with anything. We thought we were being smart, careful even. We were wrong about what careful meant out there. We picked a bluff top pullout in late October of 2022 because the air was cool and the sky out there looks clean enough to drink. I mess with landscape shots on weekends, but this wasn't a big trip. We'd been married 3 years by then, both of us 31, both of us thinking we knew how to handle backcountry camping. Cheap lantern, enamel pot, paperbacks. Our old 4Runner knows that road. It's got a ladder rack on the back that rattles when you climb it, the kind of rattle you learn to ignore after a few trips. 2 sites over, a family in a red pickup built a quick camp. Father looked about 45, mother maybe a year or 2 younger, 2 kids in their teens who moved with that efficient silence you only get from families who camp together regularly. No music, no noise, no generators up and down the rim, just the wind coming in off the Badlands and the smell of sage so strong it made my sinuses clear. We set up before sunset. The shelters out there are simple roofs with a table under them, open to the view, the kind of setup that feels safe because you can see everything coming from every direction. Angel Peak sat across a maze of white and gray ridges like a flat-topped island. The light went orange first, painting the rock formations in shades that don't exist anywhere else I've been. Then it shifted to purple, then to that particular shade of deep blue that lasts maybe 5 minutes before true darkness hits. I remember thinking the whole scene looked like something from a coffee table book, too perfect to be real, the kind of landscape that makes you understand why people used to think certain places were sacred. I was stirring ramen when movement on the rim path caught my eye. At first I thought jogger, which didn't make sense out there, but people train on weird surfaces all the time. Ultra runners do stranger things than jog along exposed bluffs at dusk. Only this wasn't a normal run. The figure moved low, torso level, arms quiet against the sides, gliding more than stepping. No headlamp or reflective anything. No sound of footfalls on gravel or the ragged breathing you always hear from someone pushing themselves at altitude. It traced the edge of the bluff in a lazy arc and stayed there, just far enough that I couldn't make out details, just a shape that was always in motion. The distance was maybe 200 yards, that middle ground where you can tell something is human-sized but can't pick out features. I kept glancing up and losing it behind rock outcroppings, and then catching it again farther along the rim, always maintaining the same strange fluidity. The ground out there breaks into dips and small shelves, loose scree patches that shift under your boots if you're not careful, spots where the edge crumbles if you get too close. The shape never changed pace for any of it. It went up a small roll in the ground without any check in rhythm, without that forward lean you always see when someone climbs, and slid down the far side like it was on rails. My spouse joked that maybe the person was training for altitude races, and I shrugged, but I kept watching. The thing about watching something that bothers you is that your brain tries to normalize it. You tell yourself stories. Maybe they're a local who knows every inch of that trail. Maybe they grew up running these paths and can do it blindfolded. Maybe they're wearing dark clothes and that's why they blend so well with the rock. Your mind does these small acts of kindness to keep the fear pushed down where it can't bother you too much. But some part of me, the part that had spent 6 years as a wildland firefighter before I took the desk job, knew the movement was wrong. When you work in the backcountry long enough, you learn to read how things move. Animals have their own rhythm, humans have theirs. This thing had neither. It had the purposeful quality of something hunting, combined with the endless patience of something that doesn't get tired. The family 2 sites over got quiet. I noticed it because they'd been talking in low, comfortable tones while they set up their camp, the kind of family conversation that's more about presence than content. Now they were still. Their father stood by the truck bed, hands resting on the side rail, facing away from the view and toward the same line of rim where I'd last seen the shape. His shoulders were rigid in a way that suggested he wasn't just stretching his back after a long drive. Dark took over between one breath and the next. That's how it happens in the desert. One moment you have enough light to see details, the next you're squinting at shapes. We turned the lantern down to stretch the fuel. No point in burning through it when we had the whole night ahead. Stars came on hard. That desert sky that makes you understand how people used to navigate by them, how they used to tell stories about them. I didn't want to fixate on the ridge path, so I did camp chores, stowed the bowls, shook out the tarp, tied a loose line that had come undone from the shelter post. The wind moved in uneven pushes, not steady enough to predict, just present enough to mask other sounds. Behind me, small pebbles ticked down the slope. The sound was distinct, rhythmic almost, like someone dropping gravel one piece at a time. I turned with the lantern, and the sound cut off instantly. The beam showed nothing but gray rock and scrub brush. I set the lantern down on the picnic table, and it started again from farther left, a soft cascade of tiny impacts. After a minute it came from the right, then behind the shelter post where the light didn't quite reach. It wasn't constant, just a quiet, spaced pattern that drew a circle around us, moving counterclockwise around our campsite. Small rocks don't roll uphill, and the slope didn't run all one way. Some spots tilted toward the bluff edge, some toward the parking area, some ran level. For the sounds to move in a circle like that, something would have to be causing them. I told myself it was animals. There are plenty out there. Ringtails, foxes, coyotes, even the occasional bobcat if you're unlucky. But it felt patterned, like something testing how close it could get without being seen, like something mapping our position in the dark, learning the layout of our camp through sound and movement. My hands started to sweat despite the dropping temperature. I wiped them on my jeans and went around to the back of the 4Runner to put the pot away, to do something normal and practical that would remind my nervous system that we were just camping, just doing what we'd done a dozen times before in a dozen other places. The dust on the bumper near the ladder rack showed a mark I hadn't seen earlier. You know how you can press your hand into dust and it leaves the shape for a while? It looked like that, but wrong. The palm was long and narrow, twisted a little to the side, like it had been jammed down to get grip on the metal. What got me were the knuckle spots. There were more than there should have been, spaced in a way my brain tried to turn into normal and couldn't. I touched it with one fingertip and a little drift of powder fell off the bumper. The mark underneath was smeared where my finger had been, but the rest remained clear. 4 knuckles where there should have been 3. The thumb impression too far to the side. The whole thing elongated in a way that suggested whoever made it had bones that bent differently than mine. My heart started doing that thing where it feels like it's beating in your throat, that physical response you can't talk yourself out of no matter how many rational explanations you try to stack up. Maybe someone from another campsite had leaned on our truck while walking by. Maybe it was an old mark I'd never noticed. Maybe the dust had settled in some weird pattern that coincidentally looked like a distorted handprint. None of those explanations felt true. "Hey," my spouse said, low from the shelter. Their voice had that particular quality that meant they were trying to stay calm while something bothered them. "I think they're packing." The family 2 sites over had moved fast without making a show of it. The cooler was already in the bed of the truck. The dome tent that had been up not long before was gone, rolled and strapped with the kind of efficiency that comes from practice. The father stepped out into the common view line like he was just stretching his legs, casual and unhurried in a way that felt deliberate. He looked right at me across the space between our sites and shaped 2 words with his mouth without sound. "Car now." His face in the dim light from their own lantern showed no panic, just absolute certainty. I didn't make a speech. I didn't ask my spouse what they thought or suggest we tough it out or convince myself we were being paranoid. Something about the father's face, about the way he'd mouthed those words, flipped a switch in my head. I just said, "We're going to head out," and we started moving like we'd trained for it. Lantern down to a low setting, chairs folded without bothering to wipe them down, sleeping bags thrown into the back with no folding, stove tossed into the storage bin without parts sorted or cleaned. I kept the light pointed low, not scanning for anything, just keeping the ground honest so we wouldn't trip and hurt ourselves in the rush. Down the slope, a dry scrape moved across stone and stopped. It sounded like someone dragging a stick across rough granite, except there was a weight to it, a deliberate quality that sticks don't have. The ladder rack let out a thin metallic note as the wind hit it from a different angle, or maybe it was something else. I didn't turn around to check. When we shut the rear hatch, my hands were shaking enough that I had to try twice to get it latched properly. The family's truck was already idling, that low diesel rumble you can feel through the ground. No headlights yet. They were turned toward the road and waiting, giving us space to pull out first since we were parked closer to the exit track. We pulled out first because we were closer to the track. I kept the beams on their lowest setting until the road dropped away from the rim, partly to preserve our night vision and partly because some instinct told me that calling attention to ourselves with bright lights would be a mistake. The surface was the kind that turns into washboard if you drive it when it's damp, and then it dries with ridges baked in, a corrugated mess that makes your fillings hurt. The steering wheel hummed in my hands, harmless and familiar, just the normal vibration of rough road travel. A quarter-mile in, the road dips through a shallow saddle before climbing toward the entrance. Standard geology for the area, nothing remarkable about it. As the Forerunner nosed over that dip, the back end sagged hard, like two people had stepped onto the rear ladder at once. I've hauled plenty of gear, loaded that rack with kayaks and bikes and camping equipment until the suspension groaned. I know what weight feels like. This was sudden and substantial, enough to make the front tires lighten on the gravel. The steering went floaty, that dangerous feeling when the front end doesn't want to track straight anymore because too much weight has shifted rearward. The tires chattered on gravel in a way I know well from loading too much weight in the back, that rapid skipping sensation that means you're close to losing traction. The metal in the rack gave off a groan I hadn't heard from it before, a deeper note that suggested real stress on the welds. "What was that?" my spouse said, not loud, not panicked, just enough to confirm it wasn't my imagination, that they'd felt it too, that the laws of physics had just told us something was now on our vehicle that hadn't been there 30 seconds ago. I didn't want to stab the brakes and pitch the weight forward. Didn't want to find out what would happen if whatever was back there got thrown off balance and toward us. I feathered them gently, feeling for traction, feeling for control. Whatever was on the rack shifted. You can feel that through the whole vehicle when you've done enough dumb camping loads over the years. You get the slide first, that lateral movement as weight redistributes. Then the frame flex, the entire body of the vehicle twisting slightly. Then the slight yaw, the rear end wanting to swap places with the front. I felt all three in sequence, each one distinct, each one confirming that something heavy was moving around back there like it was trying to find better purchase. Then a heavy drop hit the gravel behind us. It wasn't a rock. Rocks bounce and scatter and make multiple sounds as they come apart or roll. This was a one-piece landing followed by a second, lighter thump, like something landing on 2 feet instead of 4. I looked in the rearview mirror and saw dust hanging low in our taillights, illuminated red and dense. Something long dragged along the passenger side rear quarter panel as it regained balance. The sound was clean and thin, like a screwdriver line across paint, deliberate and controlled. Not the chaotic scraping of something falling off a moving vehicle. This was intentional, the sound of something steadying itself, using my truck's body as a handhold while it found its footing on the road. The family's truck behind us tapped its brakes twice, quick flashes of red, and gave us a little more space. Enough that if we needed to stop suddenly, we wouldn't get pushed. Enough to tell me they'd seen something too, that this wasn't mass hysteria or shared delusion. They were experienced enough to know that if something went wrong up ahead, they needed room to react. I kept the speed steady and the wheel straight, fighting every instinct that told me to floor it, to get as far from this place as fast as possible. Panic kills people on backcountry roads. Rollovers kill people. Losing control in the dark on washboard gravel kills people. Whatever was happening, I needed to stay controlled. The shock passed. The weight was gone. The suspension settled back to normal. But the rack rattled more than before. A new sound mixed in with the familiar one, like something had been bent or loosened. We came to the entrance sign, that big brown National Forest marker that looked beautiful in the starlight, and took the fork toward US 550 without looking anywhere but the road ahead. I didn't check the mirrors. I didn't scan the roadside. I just drove, focusing on the immediate practical reality of keeping the vehicle on the road, of not clipping a rock or dropping a wheel off the edge. We hit the highway in a pair, hazards on for the first few minutes like we were a funeral procession. The adrenaline ebbed in steps. First, when we saw another set of headlights coming from the south, a semi or RV that represented normal people doing normal things on a normal night. Then more when the first town lights showed up ahead, that orange glow on the horizon that meant electricity and gas stations and other human beings who had no idea what kind of night we'd just had. We pulled into the big bright lot by the gas station near where US 550 and US 64 meet in Bloomfield. The place was loud with regular life in a way that felt almost aggressive after the silence of the rim. Teens laughing by a car, working on something under the hood, the chime from the convenience store door opening and closing, the smell of fryer oil floating across the pumps, mixing with diesel and gasoline. That didn't make me feel safer exactly, but it put distance between us and the rim, created a buffer of normalcy. The father from the other campsite walked to the back of his truck and angled the tail light housing under the overhead lights. The red plastic had 4 gouges carved into it, deep enough that you could wedge a coin. The spacing was wrong for human fingers. They curved inward, not down, like whatever made them had wanted to grip the light fixture itself, not just scrape past it. The plastic was scored white in the deepest parts where it had been compressed before it tore. He didn't make a scene. He looked at me like this was business, like this was information being transferred from someone who knew to someone who didn't, and said the only sentence I've repeated word for word since that night. Folks call it a skinwalker. Don't camp up there solo after Halloween. We checked our own rig. The scratch started under the lower rung of the ladder rack, tracked forward across the quarter panel, and ended at the fuel door. It wasn't jagged like a branch would make. It looked planned, a single movement, straight and confident, not the flailing of something slipping or the random damage from road debris. The paint had a pale curl at the edge where whatever made the line had lifted tiny shavings as it went. I set my fingernail in it and felt it catch, felt the depth of it, felt how it had gone through the clear coat and into the color layer beneath. That kind of scratch doesn't come from anything light or accidental. It takes force, it takes intention. We didn't fill up. We didn't talk with the family about back roads or trails or who was from where or what we'd all just experienced. There was an understanding that talking about it wouldn't help, that trying to make sense of it would just make it harder to drive away. They got in and pulled out, tail lights still bright but scored, heading north while we headed south. We booked a cheap room in Farmington with a bed that felt like a board and a TV that buzzed with some electrical issue. I kept thinking about the weight on the rack and the way the suspension had communicated the truth of it. The honest sag that happens when something climbs where you didn't invite it. The physics of it. The realness of it. I didn't suggest going back in daylight to look for tracks. I didn't trace the scratch for an hour like someone obsessed. We slept badly, both of us waking at sounds that turned out to be ice machines or people walking past our door. We left early, before the free breakfast, before the sun was fully up, driving straight through back to Albuquerque where we lived. Back home, I bought a small bottle of rubbing compound and a foam pad and worked the quarter panel in the shade of the carport. Most of it blended after an hour of careful work. One thin mark stayed. Under certain angles, you can't see it at all. Under others, it shows as a hairline under the clear coat, like a faint healed cut on skin that never quite disappears. We kept the Forerunner. We kept camping. We didn't go back to that rim. 2 weeks later, I pulled the rear hatch trim to quiet a new rattle in the rack. The top bolts were shiny like they'd been rubbed with fine grit, but only on the faces that would get contact if something slid forward and then off. That wasn't from any gear we carry. We strap everything tight, use proper tie-downs, check them twice. You can say it was old damage that I never noticed. You weren't the one who cleaned those bolts last spring with a wire brush and locked them down with blue thread compound. If you need a lesson out of this, take mine. That rim feels safe because it's close to a highway and because the sites look like regular picnic spots. They are not a regular place after the last of October. If you go anyway, don't stay alone and don't get cute with your lights or your bravado. Park so your nose points out. Pack before the sky goes black. If you start hearing small rocks roll in separate places around you and it sounds like nothing when you look, stop treating it like a joke. The family who warned us didn't owe us anything. They still hung back and watched us out to the entrance sign, making sure we made it to pavement. People will tell you the story is missing proof. That's fine. Proof isn't what made me change my habits. The scratch on the quarter panel taught me more than 100 pictures could. The way the back end dropped taught me enough for 3 trips worth of lessons. The gouges in that taillight were wrong in a way that doesn't leave your head once you've seen it. Maybe it was a person trying hard to look like something else. Maybe it was a trick of angles and wind and nerves. Believe whatever lets you sleep. Just don't stay up there alone after Halloween. And if you do go, despite everything I've told you, make sure your vehicle is pointing toward the exit before dark. Make sure you can leave fast. Make sure you're not giving something the chance to decide whether you leave at all. I still have the Forerunner. I still take it camping. But I don't take unpaved roads near reservation land in late October anymore. I don't dismiss strange sounds as wind. And I check my bumper for marks I can't explain. That's what the rim taught me. That's what those few hours cost. God help anyone who learns it harder than I did. I need to say this up front so you understand I'm not spinning some campfire tale. I attended Northern Arizona University in the fall of 2022, and I used Walnut Canyon the way most students use a gym, except mine came with a view. The trail system sits close enough to campus that you can finish an afternoon class and still catch an hour of daylight on the rim. If you're from Flagstaff, you learn early to pack a headlamp and an extra layer. The temperature doesn't just drop when the sun goes down, it plummets, sometimes 20 degrees in under an hour. Late September that year, 4 of us decided to squeeze in the Island Trail Loop after our last Thursday class. We had maybe 90 minutes before the visitor center locked its gates for the night. I'd hiked that route at least a dozen times. I knew the paved sections, the metal staircases, the viewing platforms where tourists took photos of the cliff dwellings. I thought I also knew which informal side paths were just shortcuts worn in by locals' trails that reconnected to the official route within a few hundred feet. I was wrong about that. Wrong enough that I don't trust unmarked trails anymore, no matter how well traveled they look. Our group was me, Jade, Liam, and Quinn. I'm the one who actually reads the trail maps and carries a compass I know how to use. Jade's the practical one. She keeps a first aid kit in her pack and took a wilderness medicine course over the summer. Liam's strong, played football in high school, but he's not great on uneven terrain where every step requires balance. Quinn jokes through everything and showed up that day in worn-out sneakers because it's basically just stairs, right? We descended the island trail as the afternoon light turned amber. The metal steps rang under our boots. Other hikers were already heading up, making the final push before closure. We passed them with nods, and I felt that comfortable urgency you get when you're cutting it close but not actually worried. At the bottom, we walked the loop past the Sinagua cliff dwellings, stayed behind the protective barriers, and didn't linger. The shadows in the canyon were already thick and blue. When we climbed back up, breathing hard from the elevation and the pace, we reached the top of the staircase where the official trail curves right toward the visitor center. But to the left, there was a narrow footpath threading along the rim through low scrub and pale limestone shelves. The dirt looked packed and fresh, like 20 people had walked it that same day. It aimed in the general direction of the parking lot, cutting across maybe a quarter-mile of rimland instead of following the paved switchback. "That'll save us 10 minutes, I said, pointing. "It looks like it meets back up near the lot." Nobody questioned it. The sun had already slipped below the western rim, and the air had gone from warm to jacket cold in the span of 5 minutes. The path looked obvious enough. We started walking. For the first few minutes, the shortcut felt fine. We could still hear the distant hum of Interstate 40, that constant white noise you stop noticing when you live in Flagstaff. The rim up there is mostly exposed rock, with clusters of juniper and small oaks just starting to turn gold. The path stayed clear, winding between boulders and staying about 15 feet back from the canyon's edge. Then we walked past something that made Quinn stop talking mid-sentence. Behind a waist-high limestone outcrop, sheltered from the path by about 10 feet, lay a deer. Not the scattered remains you'd expect from a coyote kill or a mountain lion cache. This was arranged. The rib cage had been cleaned completely, each bone visible and white, as if someone had taken a wire brush to it. The spine was intact, curved in its natural position. The hide had been peeled back in a single piece and folded beside the skeleton like a blanket someone had just removed. There was no blood in the dirt, no drag marks, no scuff patterns showing how the carcass had gotten there, and balanced on top of one of the exposed ribs, right in the center of the chest cavity, sat a smooth river rock about the size of my fist. It wasn't wedged in. It was placed, deliberately, like a paperweight holding down a document. I knelt down, staying a few feet back, and looked for tracks. I know enough to check for prints, scat, fur caught on branches, anything that tells a story. On a patch of fine dust near the carcass, I found impressions. They started out looking human. Barefoot width, clear heel strike, visible toe definition. The prints led away from the deer in a line, heading deeper into the scrub. Then they got strange. After 3 or 4 normal steps, the angle of the foot changed. The toes began pointing inward, pigeon-toed, as if the person walking had started to turn their feet as they moved. 2 steps later, both feet were fully rotated, toes pointing inward at unnatural angles. And then, for the next 6 or 7 steps, the toe arcs faced completely backward. The prints looked like someone had been walking toward us while actually moving away. I've seen people walk backward for fun, leaving reverse tracks. These weren't like that. The stride length stayed consistent. The depth of each impression showed normal weight transfer from heel to ball. The spacing suggested a forward walking rhythm, not the shorter, cautious steps of someone moving in reverse. "This is a ranger thing," Liam said, his voice tight. "Some kind of cleanup or research project." I looked for boot treads, tire tracks, anything official. I saw nothing but those wrong-facing prints trailing off into the brush. "We need to keep moving," Jade said quietly. Her voice had that forced calm people use when they're trying not to spook a group. "We need to get back on the real trail." None of us touched the rock on the rib cage. We didn't photograph it. We just started walking again, faster than before, and closer together. About 50 yards past the deer, I started noticing the sound. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was just that every time one of us took a step, something else took a step through the brush to our left. Same pace, same rhythm. When we paused to negotiate a tricky section of trail, it paused. When we sped up, it matched us. The timing was too precise to be coincidence, like a metronome clicking alongside us. I tried to get a clean look. I'd stop suddenly and pivot, hoping to catch whatever it was off guard. But every time, I only got partials: a vertical shape behind a tree trunk, a suggestion of shoulders behind a boulder, something tall standing perfectly still in the gaps between junipers. It never stepped into the open. It stayed in that last band of shadow where the evening light couldn't quite reach. We passed another patch of exposed dust. 2 more prints waited there, side by side, toes pointing backward again. No approach marks leading to them, no trail leading away. They were just there, as if someone had stood in that spot for a moment and then vanished. "Don't step in them," Jade said. We gave the prints a wide berth. The thought of putting my boot down inside one of those impressions made my skin crawl in a way I couldn't articulate. Quinn hadn't made a joke in 10 minutes. That alone told me everyone else felt it too, this sense that we'd crossed some invisible boundary and something on the other side had noticed. I decided to test it because I needed something concrete, something that wasn't just my imagination running wild in the low light. I picked up a rock about the size of a softball from the trail edge, wound up, and hurled it hard into the scrub where I'd last heard movement. It landed with a muffled thump against brush and dirt. A heartbeat later, no more than that, a second rock came clicking back out of the same area. Not thrown hard, just tossed. A casual, sharp sound, like, "Here's yours back." There hadn't been time. Not enough time for someone to locate my rock in the brush, pick it up, and throw it back. And the sound profile was identical, same weight, same type of impact. It was as if my rock had been caught mid-flight and immediately returned. "Nope," Quinn said. "Nope, nope." Then he went quiet again. "Eyes forward," Jade said. "Don't look at it, just walk." We did, eyes forward. We focused on the trail, on our footing, on the growing glow of security lights visible ahead where the park's maintenance area backed up to the rim. That worked fine until Liam stepped on a hidden piece of basalt concealed under dried grass, and his ankle rolled hard. Liam went down with a sound that made my stomach clench, not a shout, just a sharp exhalation of real pain. Jade was beside him in seconds, pack already open, pulling out her first aid kit with the efficiency of someone who's done this before. She checked his foot for circulation, palpated the joint, wrapped it tight with an ace bandage, and gave him ibuprofen from a small bottle. "Don't test it yet," she said. "We're going to move you carefully." We did the math quickly. I'd take point and set the pace. Quinn would stay 10 steps behind me as relay. Jade would support Liam's bad side and keep weight off the injured ankle. The plan was simple. No running, no splitting up, no stopping unless absolutely necessary. The thing in the brush adjusted to our new, slower pace like it had been training with us all season. If we paused, silence. If we took 3 steps, 3 steps echoed from the tree line. Once, when I spun around fast enough, I caught a shape that could have been a tall person standing motionless between 2 junipers. The proportions were wrong, though. The arms hung too low. The head tilted at an angle that didn't match any posture I recognized. It didn't duck or hide when I looked directly at it. It just held perfectly still until the fading light and my own doubting eyes lost the outline. We crossed another dust patch. 2 more prints waited there, side by side, toes facing backward. No trail leading in, no trail leading out. We stepped around them. The maintenance area appeared ahead, surrounded by chain-link fence topped with barbed wire. Security lights had clicked on automatically, casting harsh white pools across stacked lumber and equipment. I could see a pale cinder block building and one of those green utility carts the staff use on service roads. We reached the nearest gate, locked. A fat padlock hung from the chain. I rattled it once, then stopped because the sound felt too loud, too much like ringing a dinner bell. Inside the fence, everything looked normal and human and safe. Outside, in the tree line just beyond where the security lights reached, something stood and matched our position step for step. If I moved 2 steps right, the silhouette did too, At first glance, it read as human, a tall person in dark clothing. But the longer I looked, the more wrong the proportions felt. The arms hung lower than they should. The way the head turned suggested the neck attached higher on the back than anatomy allowed. A utility cart's electric whine cut through the silence. A staff member in his 40s rounded the far end of the fence onto the service road. He took in our situation immediately. 4 hikers at a locked gate, 1 injured, something lingering just outside the light. He didn't waste time with questions. He waved hard, pointing toward a service gate around the corner, and started moving. We started hobbling after him. That's the only word for it, hobbling. Liam's adrenaline had worn off completely, and now the ankle was a throbbing problem that made him hiss with each step. As we moved, the silhouette outside the fence changed posture. It shifted from standing still to something ready, coiled. Then it broke into a run parallel to us, maintaining a strict distance from the light line as if there was tape on the ground it refused to cross. But it didn't run right. The arm swing was off. The gait was too smooth, too effortless, eating ground in a way that looked strong without looking like it required any effort at all. It peeled off into the brush at the corner where the fence turned, disappearing. Liam lost it for a second, not screaming, but panic breathing in a way that made him sway. He dropped to one knee, hand on the ground. I lunged forward to grab his other arm. Something else got there first. I felt it before I saw it. A pressure on Liam's upper arm, a strong, steady push upward, like someone helping him stand. Except the contact points were wrong. The grip had too much spread between the fingers. The touch was cold and the strength was undeniable, leaving pressure marks I could see forming even in the bad light. Liam lurched upward as if hauled by an invisible handle. He stared at me with wide, broken eyes. I shook my head. I had no explanation to offer him. The maintenance worker met us at the service gate, keys already in hand. He opened it, waved us through, locked it behind us, and kept his voice low and steady the way people who actually handle emergencies talk when they know how fast things can deteriorate. He didn't tell stories. He didn't lecture. He glanced at Liam's bandaged ankle, said, "Good work on that," and gestured toward his cart. "Get in." The only extra thing he did was point at the dust outside the fence as he swung the gate shut. 2 clean impressions marked the ground there, toes arcs pointing wrong again, facing back the way we'd come while the heels pointed toward us. "Don't cut that trail," he said. "People have been warned. Some things track you when you break the rules." That was it. No smile, no spooky tone, just a flat statement of fact. He drove us the back way to the parking lot, staying on service roads we didn't know existed. He parked beside the visitor center and watched while we got into our car. He kept watching until our headlights were on and we were pulling onto Walnut Canyon Road. He didn't wave. He didn't try to tell us more. I respect him for that. At home, Liam showered and sent a photo to our group chat even though none of us had asked for one. He developed a bruise on his upper arm, forming in the distinct shape of a handprint, except the fingers were long bars of pressure that didn't match anyone in our group. Jade measured it against her own hand because that's who she is, methodical, needing data. The finger spans were wrong, too wide, too long. The thumb placement was off. That bruise took nearly 3 weeks to fade, longer than it should have based on how deep the blood had pooled under his skin. His ankle healed faster. We went back the next day. Not to that trail, to the visitor center, to ask casual questions about hours and closures in a normal, friendly way. The front desk staff told us the posted times, reminded us to stay on marked trails, and mentioned that rangers do occasional patrols but can't cover every area. We didn't mention the deer. I don't know why. Maybe because saying it out loud would have made it sound like we were telling a story for attention. None of us wanted that. We hiked the official route that day. We didn't take shortcuts, even the ones that obviously just cut off a gentle curve and rejoined the main trail 20 yards later. We didn't see anything unusual. The wind made normal grass sounds. Our boots scuffed rock like boots should. The only other people we encountered were a retired couple from Iowa who asked where the restrooms were. It was just a park again. But Liam kept that ace bandage in his truck afterward. Quinn bought real hiking boots. Jade started carrying 2 headlamps so she could loan one out if needed, and I stopped cutting trails anywhere, even when I'm absolutely certain they just reconnect around a single tree. I know the erosion argument for staying on marked paths, and I believed it before. But now I follow the rules because they seem designed to keep something else from noticing you. Call that superstition if you want. I call it risk management. I've thrown rocks in the woods dozens of times before and since. I've never had one thrown back from the same spot, same weight, same sound, in the same second. I've seen animal tracks that looked strange due to erosion or overlay. I've never seen footprints with toes facing backward that couldn't be explained by someone literally walking in reverse. I've helped friends up off the ground more times than I can count. I have never felt a stranger's hand reach them before mine did. I don't use certain words lightly, and I won't pretend to understand what they mean to people whose traditions and knowledge systems aren't mine. I'll just say the behavior fit the pattern that students around Flagstaff talk about when they share trail warnings. Pacing, mirroring, matching steps, staying just out of clean view until the moment it becomes conveniently inhuman. You can call it a trespasser messing with us. You can call it a tall trail runner with unusual gait. You can call it a trick of distance, stress, and failing light. Pick whatever explanation helps you sleep at night. I'm not here to argue or convince you. I'm here to tell you what happened and what I learned. A 5-minute shortcut near closing time isn't a shortcut if it puts you somewhere a maintenance worker has to extract you from through a service gate. If you hike near Walnut Canyon and you see a narrow track along the rim that looks like it'll save you time, don't take it. Use the official trail and be bored for an extra 10 minutes. Bring a headlamp even if you swear you won't need it. Wear boots that won't fold your ankle. Travel in groups. And if you were the tall outline pacing us that evening in late September 2022, or if you're anything like it, I have one simple request. Let's not meet. I arrived in Sedona on the last Tuesday of October, when the summer heat had finally broken and the tourist season was winding down. The rental cabin I'd booked sat on the outskirts of town, a small A-frame with a view of the red rocks that glowed like embers at sunset. I'd been planning this trip for months, a solo hiking expedition to clear my head after a brutal year at work. My therapist had suggested it. Time alone, she said, to reconnect with myself away from the noise of the city. West Fork Oak Creek had been on my list for years. I'd seen countless photos online. Brilliant fall foliage reflected in crystal clear water, towering canyon walls that seemed to cradle the trail in their ancient arms. The reviews all mentioned the crowds, though, so I'd deliberately chosen late October, hoping the hordes of weekend warriors and Instagram seekers would have thinned out. That morning, I'd stopped at a small market on Highway 89A to grab water and trail mix. The place was cramped and dim, smelling of old wood and coffee that had been sitting too long on the burner. An older woman worked the register, her weathered hands moving mechanically as she scanned my items. She had that local look, sun-damaged skin, eyes that had seen too many seasons, a wariness that comes from living in a place where nature still makes the rules. "Hiking today?" she asked, her voice rough as sandpaper. "Yeah, West Fork," I replied, pulling out my wallet. "Supposed to be beautiful this time of year." Her hands paused. She looked up at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Not concern, exactly. Something harder than that. "You planning to be out there late?" "No, just a few hours, in and out before dark." She nodded slowly, then leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping. "Good. Don't be in that canyon after the sun drops behind the rim. Things out there. They call your name. They sound like people you know, but they're not." She held my gaze for a long moment. "If you hear your name and you're alone, don't answer. Just get out." I gave her what I hoped was a reassuring smile, the kind you give people who watch too many paranormal shows. "I'll be careful. I've done plenty of solo hiking." "I'm sure you have." She handed me my receipt, but didn't let go right away. "Just remember what I said. Be out before dark." As I left the store, I felt a prickle of unease that I immediately tried to rationalize away. Local color, I told myself. Every remote hiking area has its stories, tales meant to keep tourists cautious, to add a little thrill to their adventure. I'd heard similar warnings before, about everything from mountain lions to abandoned mines. Besides, I'd heard the word skinwalker thrown around in online forums. Always in that breathless way, people talk about urban legends they don't really believe in, stories to fill silence around campfires. But as I drove up 89A toward the trailhead, her words kept circling back. "They sound like people you know." The Call of the Canyon day use area was nearly empty when I pulled in around noon. Just 2 other vehicles in the lot, a mud-splattered Jeep and a sedan with California plates. I paid my $8 at the self-service kiosk, shouldered my day pack, and checked my phone one last time. Full battery, but only 1 bar of service that flickered and died as I approached the trailhead. The little footbridge spanned Oak Creek just beyond the parking area, a sturdy wooden structure that thrummed slightly under my boots. The water below ran clear and cold, rushing over smooth stones worn down by centuries of current. I paused at the far end to tighten my bootlaces and adjust my pack straps, taking a moment to appreciate the view. Red canyon walls rose on either side, their faces striated with layers of geological time, rust and cream and burnt orange. Cottonwood trees lined the banks, their leaves turning that brilliant gold that only happens for a brief window each fall. The plan was simple and conservative. Follow Trail 108 for a few miles, shoot some long-exposure photographs where the leaves gathered in the slow pools, maybe find a good spot to eat lunch, then turn around by 3:30 at the latest. That would put me back at the car by 5, well before the 6:15 sunset. I'm methodical about my hiking, I always have been. I carry the 10 essentials, I check weather reports, I tell people where I'm going. Except I hadn't told anyone I was here. My phone had no service, and I'd left before remembering to text my brother. It was a stupid oversight, the kind of thing you don't realize matters until it does. The first mile of trail lived up to its reputation. The path was wide and well-maintained, packed dirt that showed the passage of countless boots. I crossed the creek 3 times in that first stretch, boulder hopping where I could, wading through ankle-deep water where I couldn't. The cold made me gasp at first, snow melt from higher elevations, still feeding the stream even this late in the season. But it was invigorating, that shock of cold that makes you feel awake and alive. I passed the stone remnants of what a trail sign identified as the old Mayhew Lodge, built back in the 1922, when this canyon was someone's idea of a resort destination. Now just tumbled walls and a foundation being slowly reclaimed by moss and falling leaves. Something about abandoned places in the wilderness has always unsettled me, the way nature erases human effort so completely, so efficiently. We think we're permanent, but we're not. Beyond the ruins, the canyon began to narrow. The walls rose higher, boxing in the light, and the temperature dropped noticeably. I found myself pulling my fleece out of my pack earlier than I'd expected. The shade here had weight to it, a thickness that felt almost tangible. I told myself it was just the canyon effect, cold air pooled at the bottom, cut off from direct sunlight for most of the day. I started counting crossings out of habit, a trick I'd picked up years ago to help pace myself and establish turnaround points. 1, 2, 3. The rhythm of it was soothing, meditative. By the 6th crossing, I was deep enough into the canyon that the sound of the highway had vanished completely, replaced by the constant murmur of water and the occasional scrape of wind through the cottonwoods. That's where I saw the tracks. The sandbar was broad and flat, positioned at a bend where the creek had deposited decades of fine sediment. Fresh boot prints traced across it, probably from hikers earlier that morning when I'd still been drinking coffee at my cabin. The treads were clear, recent, not yet softened by the wind. But it was the other tracks that made me stop. Elk tracks, large and deep, moved alongside the boot prints for several feet. 4-toed impressions pressed into the damp sand, each one sharp-edged and distinct. I'd seen plenty of elk sign before. I knew what they looked like. These were fresh too, probably from the previous night when the animals came down to drink. What bothered me was the way they pivoted. Midway across the sandbar, the elk tracks suddenly kinked, not gradually, the way an animal naturally changes direction, but sharply. The hoofprints didn't blur or drag, they simply pointed in a different direction. All 4 hooves lifted and reset at an angle that didn't make sense for an animal's gait. Then they traced back the exact way they'd come, each print placed with uncanny precision beside its outbound twin. I crouched down, studying the pattern. The sand around the prints showed no scuff marks, no evidence of the animal stumbling or being startled. It was as if the elk had simply reversed its own footsteps, walking backward without turning around. A cold finger of unease traced down my back. I told myself the creek must have undercut the sandbar, distorting the prints in some way I wasn't seeing. Or maybe I was misreading the sign entirely. I'm not a professional tracker. But even as I rationalized it, some older part of my brain was sending warning signals that I couldn't quite silence. I stood and kept walking, but I found myself checking over my shoulder more often than I had before. The 7th crossing came quickly, and then the 8th. The canyon walls were close enough now that I had to crane my neck to see the rim. The light had that blue-gray quality of deep shade, and the temperature continued to drop. I could see my breath when I exhaled. That's when it happened the first time. I was standing knee-deep in the creek, angle-stepping across to avoid the deeper channel, when someone said my name. Not shouted, not whispered, just said it, clearly. From across the water, maybe 20 feet away, where a tongue of gravel met the far bank. The voice was my brother's. Not similar to his voice. Not a close approximation. It was, exactly, his voice, the specific timbre and rhythm, the way he lands hard on the last syllable like he's trying to get my attention without actually shouting. That slightly amused tone he uses when he's about to tell me I'm overthinking something. My head snapped up. I scanned the gravel bar, the brush beyond it, the shadows under the overhanging cottonwood roots. Nothing. No one. Hello? My voice sounded small in the canyon, quickly absorbed by the sound of rushing water. No response. Just the creek, and the whisper of wind in the high branches, and my own pulse beginning to hammer in my ears. I stood there in the water for a long moment, waiting. My brother was 2 states away, sitting at his desk in a climate-controlled office, probably on his 3rd cup of coffee. He wasn't here. He couldn't be here. I hadn't told him I was coming to Sedona. The rational part of my brain immediately began constructing explanations. Sound does strange things in canyons. Echoes can carry for miles, bouncing off walls, bending around obstacles. Maybe there were other hikers somewhere ahead, and I'd heard a fragment of their conversation distorted by distance and stone. Maybe someone had called out a name that sounded like mine, and my anxious brain had filled in the rest. But I'd never heard an echo that perfect before, that intimate. My hands were shaking slightly as I pulled my phone from my pants pocket and moved it to my chest pocket, zipping it in securely. No service out here anyway, but I wanted it close, accessible, a talisman against the sudden vulnerability I felt. I told myself I'd push on for another 15 minutes, just long enough to find a good spot for photos, and then I'd turn around. No reason to panic, no reason to let some acoustic trick ruin a beautiful hike, but I needed a marker, some way to test whether my paranoia was justified. At the next sandbar, beside a thick cottonwood root that broke through the bank like a gnarled fist, I used the metal tip of my trekking pole to scrape a straight line in the damp sand. 6 inches long, perfectly straight, deliberate, a control mark. If it looked the same on my way back out, I'd know I was just being foolish. If it didn't, well, I'd deal with that then. I pushed on to the 9th crossing, then the 10th. At a slow, mirror-calm pool backed by a sheer red wall, I stopped and pulled out my camera. The reflection was perfect, limestone cliffs and golden cottonwoods doubled in the still water. I set up my tripod with mechanical precision, trying to focus on the familiar ritual of photography. F-stop, shutter speed, composition, normal things. But my fingers were stiff with cold, and I kept looking over my shoulder. After 3 shots that I knew wouldn't be usable, my heart rate was too elevated, my hands too unsteady. I packed up my gear and started back. The sun had moved enough that the patches of direct light had shifted, and the shadows felt deeper, heavier. As I approached the 11th crossing, I heard voices behind me, distant but clear, 2 people talking, their words too muffled to make out, but their tone casual, relaxed. Other hikers, normal people on a normal hike. The sound of them eased the tension in my shoulders slightly. Then the voices stopped, not faded with distance, just stopped, mid-sentence, as if someone had pressed a mute button. The silence that followed felt wrong, too complete. At the 11th crossing, I saw it. Right in the center of my own boot print, the heel impression still crisp and clear. Where I'd stepped in the soft sand, someone had placed 3 smooth creek stones. They were stacked one atop the other, still wet, balanced carefully on a single red cottonwood leaf. I stopped so abruptly I nearly lost my footing. I'd walked through this exact spot 60 seconds earlier, maybe 90. I'd been watching my footing, counting crossings allowed to keep my pace steady, and this stack hadn't been here. I would have noticed. I would have stepped on it. There were no other footprints near it, no scuffs in the sand, no disturbances, just my own track, and these 3 stones, and the leaf beneath them still bright with water. My mouth went dry. I turned in a slow circle, scanning every shadow, every undercut bank, every gap in the brush. The canyon walls rose on either side, offering 1,000 hiding places. The creek rushed past, its sound suddenly too loud, masking any other noise that might have warned me I wasn't alone. That's when I saw the forearms. They emerged from beneath a massive fallen cottonwood that bridged the creek about 30 feet downstream. Bare skin, pale in the dim light, stretched over long bones. The hands pressed flat against the wet sand, fingers splayed wide, as if testing the ground's firmness, or preparing to push off. The position was wrong, all wrong. The angle suggested someone crouched on all 4s beneath the log, but no one should be able to fit in that space. It was too low, too narrow, and the arms were too long, the joints bending at angles that made my stomach clench with instinctive wrongness. I couldn't see ahead. just the arms and hands, motionless in the shadow. Then the thing my brain insisted. No longer person let out a soft sound. Not quite a whistle, not quite a wheeze. A wet, breathy noise that might have been words if you were already expecting words. If I'd been primed to hear language, I might have interpreted it as, "Come back," spoken in a voice that had forgotten how mouths work. I didn't realize I was backing away until I felt the cold bite of water around my calves. I'd stepped into the creek without looking, without turning around. Some survival instinct had taken over, the kind that knows not to turn your back on predators. I eased myself up the opposite bank, feeling behind me with my trekking pole for stable ground, never taking my eyes off that shadowed space beneath the log. The arms didn't move. The hands remained flat and spread, but I knew with a certainty that bypassed all logic that it was watching me. 10, I said aloud, my voice cracking. 9, 8, I was counting backward now, counting crossings in reverse, using the numbers like a prayer to keep my mind from fracturing. The poles clicked against stone as I moved, and I focused on that sound, on the rhythm of it, on anything but the image of those two long arms burned into my vision. At the 10th crossing, the voice came again. My name, my brother's voice. But this time it was off just a half beat too slow, like someone reciting a phrase they'd memorized phonetically without understanding the meaning. The rhythm was close but not quite right, and that tiny wrongness was worse than if it had been completely alien. 9, I said louder, and kept walking. 8, 7, don't run. Running triggers chase instincts. I'd read that somewhere, about predators, about attacks. Keep moving, but don't run. Stay calm, stay focused. At crossing 8, I looked for my marker. The straight line I'd drawn with my trekking pole was still there, but it had been altered. 2 parallel grooves, each about as wide as a finger, had been dragged across it in a wide arc. The furrows were fresh, the sand at their edges still crumbled and loose. They pointed toward me, converging like the lines in a perspective drawing, all pointing back to where I'd been standing when I made the original mark. Someone had been here, close enough to touch what I'd touched, close enough to crouch down and deliberately deface my mark while I was just around the bend, close enough to have reached out and grabbed my ankle while I drew that line, if it had wanted to. The coyotes started up somewhere on the rim above me, that high, wavering chorus that sounds like laughter if you're in the right mood and screaming if you're not. I wasn't in the right mood. The sound rose and fell, overlapping voices, creating that chaotic harmony that makes it impossible to count individual animals. Then a sharp crack echoed off the canyon wall, something between a gunshot and a branch breaking, and the coyotes went silent. Not gradually, not a slow fade as they lost interest or moved away. They just stopped, all at once, as if something had silenced them. I kept moving, my eyes locked on the trail ahead, trying to remember the exact sequence of crossings. 7, 6, 5. Each number brought me closer to the footbridge, closer to the parking lot, closer to people and cars and the illusion of safety. At one of the shallow bends, I'd lost track of which number. I glanced down at my own boot print in a patch of damp sand. Another stack, 3 stones, pressed into my heel print this time, with a leaf folded underneath the smallest rock. It hadn't been there when I passed this spot before. I would have seen it. I would have stepped on it. The realization hit me like cold water. Whatever was out here wasn't just following me. It was tracking, tell me, using my own footprints as markers, the same way I was using crossings and landmarks. It was learning my methods, adapting to my behavior, and it was faster than me. I stepped off the trail and into the middle of the creek. The water immediately pushed at my knees, trying to unbalance me, and the cold was shocking even through my hiking pants. Within seconds, my socks were soaked, my toes going numb. I knew this was a good way to catch a cramp, knew that hypothermia could set in faster than most people realized, but the water would wash away my tracks. It would erase the breadcrumb trail I'd been leaving. I broke a thin twig from a low-hanging cottonwood branch and tucked it behind my ear, a timer. When it drooped and fell from my body heat warming it, I'd know I'd been in the water too long. I'd force myself to think about getting to safety rather than just away from what was behind me. The next voice stopped me mid-step. "Sweetheart." My mother's voice, not shouted, but projected the same tone she uses at my nephew's baseball games when she wants him to hear her over the crowd. But there was an edge to it I couldn't place, a strain, a quality that suggested vocal cords being used in a way they weren't designed for. "Sweetheart." It came again, from ahead of me this time, then, overlapping the echo, from behind me. "Help me." 2 voices, 2 directions, The same voice, but impossible because my mother was 1,000 miles away, safe in her house, probably cooking dinner or watching the news. She wasn't here. She couldn't be here, and she would never call me sweetheart. That detail, small, specific, wrong, cut through the fear fog in my brain like a knife. My mother doesn't use endearments like that. She uses my name, or honey occasionally, but never sweetheart. It's not her word, not her voice pattern. Whatever was out here was good at imitation, but it wasn't perfect. It had made a mistake. I kept moving through the water, my boots slipping on algae-slick stones, my thighs burning with the effort of pushing against the current. I started talking to myself, not in my head but out loud, anchoring myself to my own voice. Footbridge, paved path, gate, highway, parking lot, car. I said the names of the places between here and safety, a litany of normal things. Footbridge, paved path, gate, highway. My voice was shaking, but it was mine. Real, human. Around a broad bend, the canyon opened slightly into a stretch of shallow water and exposed gravel. Sunset light touched the upper rim for the first time in hours, turning the rock faces blood orange, and that's where I saw it clearly for the first time. It moved across the stones upstream from me on its hands and knees, but wrong. Elbows and knees hitting the ground in turns instead of in pairs. Right elbow, left knee, left elbow, right knee. The gait of something that had studied human movement but hadn't quite mastered the pattern. The shoulders and hips rose and dropped with each placement, creating a rolling, undulating motion that made my vision swim. It didn't splash. Despite moving through several inches of water, it made no sound beyond the soft click of joints bending, of bone moving against bone. The head turned as it moved, swiveling to track me while the body continued forward. The neck rotated too far, 30 degrees past what human anatomy allows. The face stayed in shadow, but I could see the general shape of it. Almost right, almost human, but flattened somehow, as if all the proportions had been translated through a corrupted algorithm. I realized something then, standing hip-deep in frigid water with my muscles beginning to seize. It only made sound when I couldn't see it directly. Every time it had called my name, every time it had mimicked my family's voices, I'd been looking away, either around a bend, or focused on my footing, or scanning the brush on the opposite bank. But now, with my eyes locked directly on it, it moved in perfect silence. It was a trap. The voices were designed to make me look away, to make me turn my head, to break visual contact so it could close the distance while I searched for the source of the sound. I forced myself to keep watching it even as I continued downstream. My peripheral vision caught the bright gap in the canyon where West Fork met Oak Creek. The footbridge wasn't far past that junction, maybe a quarter mile, 300 yards, 5 minutes at a normal pace. But my legs were cramping now, the muscles in my thighs seizing from the cold and the effort. The twig fell from my ear, drifting away on the current. I'd been in the water too long. The thing kept pace with me, 40 feet away, moving with that horrible rolling gait. Then it rose slightly, the back arching, the head lifting, and I saw the face catch a sliver of fading light. I won't describe it in detail. I can't. My brain refused to process what I was seeing, the same way it refuses to accept optical illusions, even when you know the trick. The proportions weren't just wrong. They were conditional. They seemed to change depending on the angle of light, or perhaps on how hard I tried to focus on specific features. Eyes where they should be, but too far apart, or too close together. Both, somehow, neither. What I can tell you is that I understood, in that moment, that I wasn't looking at something that had once been human. This wasn't a person experiencing a medical emergency or a mental health crisis. This wasn't someone hurt or lost or confused. This was something else. Something that wore the shape of human as a costume, a lure, a trap. I ran. The cramping in my legs became irrelevant. The cold became irrelevant. All that mattered was the strip of brighter sky ahead, the promise of the junction, the hope of the footbridge. My boots splashed through the shallow water at the confluence, and I angled toward the bank, scrambling up onto the dirt trail. Behind me, I couldn't stop myself from looking. The shape had risen to a hunched bipedal stance. Shoulders forward, head down, arms hanging loose. It swayed slightly, as if testing balance. Then it lowered again, folding in on itself. And something about that deliberate change of posture was worse than anything that had come before. It was considering, deciding, choosing its next move. I ran harder. The paved path appeared, a ribbon of blessed civilization cutting through the wilderness. My boots hit the pavement with sharp cracks that echoed off the walls. The day-use restroom, the interpretive signs, the small gate that marked the boundary between wilderness and development. Through the cottonwoods, I could see the highway, that beautiful gray strip of asphalt, with its yellow lines and traffic signs, and the promise of other human beings who lived in a world where things like this didn't happen. I came out onto the shoulder, waving my arms like a drowning person, like someone whose house was on fire, like someone who had just realized that all the safety they'd taken for granted was an illusion. A silver SUV was passing northbound. The driver, a man in his 50s with reading glasses pushed up on his head, locked eyes with me and slammed on his brakes. The vehicle skidded slightly, tires chirping on the pavement. I was already at the back door before he'd fully stopped, pulling at the handle, yanking it open. I didn't have a story prepared. I didn't have anything except the truth, stripped of any pretense of calm. "Someone's following me," I gasped, pointing back toward the trailhead. "Someone's back there, please." The woman in the passenger seat, his wife, I assumed, turned to look past me, her face going pale. She grabbed her husband's arm hard enough that I could see her knuckles go white even from outside the vehicle. "Get in," the man said, his voice tight. "Get in now." I threw myself into the back seat, not bothering with the seatbelt, twisting around to watch the mouth of the trail. The headlights were on now, automatic sensors triggering in the gathering dusk, and their beams illuminated the last 50 feet of the paved path. At the very edge of the light, where gravel met asphalt shoulder, something stood, not crouched, not hunched, standing, with a posture that suggested it wanted to be seen, wanted us to see it. A silhouette against the darkening canyon mouth, perfectly still. You know when someone doesn't want their face in light. It's not something you can quantify or explain, but you know it, you feel it. The way a person will angle their head, turn their shoulders, position themselves to keep their features in shadow even when moving toward illumination. This thing did that, deliberately. "Oh my God," the man whispered. "Drive," his wife said. "Drive now." The SUV jerked forward, tires spitting gravel, and we accelerated up 89A. I kept my face pressed to the rear window, watching the trailhead recede. The figure didn't follow us onto the pavement. It didn't move at all. It just stood there, at the threshold between one world and another, and watched us leave. My hands were shaking so badly I dropped my phone twice before I could unlock it. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving behind a trembling weakness that made my joints feel loose, disconnected. "Do you need a hospital?" the woman asked, turning in her seat to look at me. Her face was kind, concerned, but there was fear in her eyes too. She'd seen what I'd seen. "No, I'm okay. Just, can you take me back to the parking lot? My car's there. I need to." I didn't know what I needed. To get away. To document this. To prove to myself it had happened. "We should call the police," the man said. "Yes," I managed. "Yes, okay." I dialed 911 with trembling fingers. When the dispatcher answered, I forced myself to speak calmly, to stick to facts. "I'm calling to report. I was followed on the West Fork Trail, off 89A, call of the Canyon Trailhead. Someone was following me. They were leaving markers on my footprints. They called my name. I paused, aware of how insane this would sound. "I need to report this." The dispatcher's voice was professional, practiced. She took my location, my name, a brief description of events. I didn't try to explain the details. I didn't mention the way it moved, or the voices, or the face that wasn't a face. I just said, followed, markers, voices I recognized, facts, concrete things. A deputy from the Coconino County Sheriff's Office met us in the day-use parking lot 20 minutes later. His cruiser's lights painted the cottonwoods red and blue. He took my statement standing beside his vehicle, writing in a notebook with careful block letters. "And you're certain you were alone on the trail?" he asked. "I was alone when I started, but something." I gestured helplessly toward the canyon mouth. "Something was out there." He nodded, his expression neutral. "Cops are good at that, at not showing whether they believe you or think you're crazy. I'll do a pass with my lights on before you leave. Make sure nothing's obviously wrong. Thank you." He drove slowly through the parking area, his spotlight sweeping across the trees, the restrooms, the information kiosk. When he finished, he pulled up beside me and rolled down his window. "Lot's clear. But I'd recommend you don't hike alone out here anymore, especially near dusk. We get bears sometimes, mountain lions. Wildlife can behave unpredictably." Wildlife. He was giving me an out, a rational explanation I could accept if I wanted to. I almost took it. "Okay," I said. "Thank you." The couple had waited with me the entire time. Before they left, the woman squeezed my hand. "Be safe," she said, "and God bless you." I sat in my car for a long time after they drove away, just sitting in the driver's seat with the doors locked and the engine running. The heater blasted warm air that slowly thawed my numb feet. The deputy had told me to come back the next day in daylight to walk him to my car, to check for any damage or evidence of tampering. But the next afternoon, when I met him there, we found something I hadn't expected. On my rear quarter panel, the driver's side, facing the trail, there were smears in dried red sediment, handprints, dragged through mud or clay, left to dry in the sun. The deputy crouched beside them, studying the patterns. "How tall are you?" he asked. 5'7". He frowned. "These are low, real low, like someone was crouched down, or..." He rubbed one with his thumb, and the dried sediment stained his skin, rust red. "Or on their hands and knees." He took photos for his report, documented the smears, measured their height from the ground, asked if I'd parked anywhere near mud or clay that might have transferred these marks. I hadn't. "I'll add it to the report," he said finally. "Classified as harassment, suspicious person. If you have any other incidents, call it in immediately." I drove back to my cabin in a daze. That night, I couldn't sleep, though I didn't use those words. I lay awake, listening to every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind against the windows. The porch light stayed on. I kept my phone on the nightstand, volume turned up, the emergency dial screen already open. It wasn't until the next morning, packing my things to check out a day early, that I thought to check my phone's apps. The voice memo app had recorded 5 minutes and 43 seconds of audio. I didn't remember starting a recording. I must have activated it accidentally when I shoved the phone into my chest pocket, fumbling with numb fingers. I almost deleted it without listening. Almost. Most of the audio was exactly what you'd expect. Running water, my jacket rustling with each gasping breath, the sharp scrape of my boots on stone. But at the 2-minute mark, clear as day, a voice called out my mother's name. Not my voice. I wasn't calling for her. This was someone else's voice, hoarse, strained, unpracticed, calling out the name of the woman who'd raised me, trying to summon her, perhaps, or trying to summon me by using her as bait. At 4 minutes and 12 seconds, it happened again. Slightly different pronunciation this time, as if the speaker was testing variations, learning. I sent my mother a text. "Where were you yesterday afternoon around 3 p.m.? Her response came quickly. "At home. Why? Is everything okay?" "Everything's fine. Just checking. Love you." I didn't send her the audio. I don't know if I ever will. I emailed the file to myself and saved a copy to 3 different cloud services. I screenshotted the file properties, the timestamp, the length, the waveform visualization, and saved the deputy's incident number. The ranger who eventually returned my call about my follow-up questions logged it formally. Harassment. Suspicious person. That's fair. That's factual. I don't have names or faces. I don't have explanations that make sense. A coworker of mine, later someone whose grandmother was from a Navajo community near Flagstaff, listened to my story one evening after work. She didn't interrupt, didn't ask questions. When I finished, she said one word, then stood up and left the break room. I didn't ask her to explain. These stories aren't mine to tell. I stopped recounting the funny version of this story at parties, the one where people wait for a punchline or a jump scare. There isn't one. There's just what happened, and the choices I made afterward. I refuse to hike West Fork near dusk now. If I go back, and I haven't decided if I will, I'll go at noon with someone I trust, with a headlamp in my pocket and extra layers, because the temperature drops fast in that canyon no matter what the forecast says. For a month after I got home, I left my porch light on every night. I answered calls from family members on speakerphone, checking their tone, their word choices, their rhythm, making sure it was really them. I didn't jump at my phone when it rang, but I stopped answering it immediately. I let it ring twice, 3 times, while I prepared myself for the possibility that the voice on the other end might be one I recognized but shouldn't trust. Nothing else called my name from my yard. No stones appeared on my porch steps. No muddy handprints dried on my car doors. If you're looking for the part where it follows me home, where this becomes an ongoing haunting, that chapter isn't here. Whatever was in that canyon stayed in that canyon. It had its territory, its hunting ground, and I'm not part of it anymore. If you want proof, I can offer what I have. The sheriff's incident number, the timestamp on the voice memo, GPS coordinates for the exact crossing where I found the stone stacks when I went back in daylight with the deputy. Photos of handprints on my car panel, still visible in the images even though I scrubbed them away with solvent that same afternoon. The rest is the part I'm asking you to believe, Or not, if you go to West Fork and people will, because it's beautiful. Because photos don't capture the menace that waits there. Turn around earlier than you think you should. Count your crossings. Pay attention to your own markers. Stay out of the sand if something starts marking your prints. Don't leave traces for it to follow, to study, to learn from. And if the canyon gets personal, if someone you love starts calling you from 2 directions at once with a voice that's almost right but not quite, don't answer. Don't try to find them. Don't try to help. Walk the creek until you see the footbridge. Keep your eyes on the water and the way out. Move steadily, not frantically. Don't run until you're sure you can make it. I did all of this, and nothing followed me onto the highway. That's the only reason I'm alive, to write this down, to post it as a warning, to hope that someone else will read it and choose differently. That's the only reason I'm here at all. I grew up working sheep around Kayenta, Arizona, right near the Utah line off U.S. Route 163. Out here, you learn early that the desert changes fast when the summer monsoons roll in. Dust one hour, a wall of rain the next, and lightning cracking down on open ground like God's own hammer splitting the earth. In early August 2021, after one of those storms that turned the sky green and made your teeth ache from the pressure change, I was helping my neighbor Wade with his flock. His nephew was up near Dennehotso hauling hay bales for the season, so it was just the 2 of us fixing fence and making sure nothing got out before nightfall. The pen sat about 15 minutes northwest of town, past the rusted water tanks and out toward a shallow ravine that drained toward Segi Canyon. I'd been out there dozens of times since I was 12 years old, learning the trade from my father before he passed. I'd never seen anything like what happened that evening. The ground was still soft from the downpour, sucking at our boots with each step, and the air had that thick, damp smell you only get after a desert rain, wet sage and creosote mixed with ozone. The sheep were restless, bunching together in the northeast corner of the pen instead of spreading out to graze like they normally would after a storm. I remember thinking it was odd but not alarming. Animals get spooked by thunder. I was retying the wire at the south corner, my fingers slick with mud and rust, when I noticed one of the sheep standing oddly still in the far pen, maybe 40 yards from where I worked. It wasn't grazing, wasn't shifting its weight from hoof to hoof, wasn't even flicking its ears at the flies. It just stood there, locked in place like something had pinned it to the ground with an invisible stake. At first I thought it was sick, maybe bloat or some kind of neurological thing, but then I saw the eyes. Sheep don't watch you the way people do. They glance, they startle, they look away. They don't track you side to side with focused intention. This one did, following me as I moved along the fence line, its head turning smoothly, deliberately. The hair on my arms stood up despite the heat. I called out to Wade to check the count, my voice sounding thin against the empty desert, and the thing snapped its head toward me so fast I heard the joints crack from where I stood. Before I could make sense of it, before my brain could catch up with what my eyes were seeing, it broke into a run, not the bounding, uneven gait of a sheep startled by a coyote, but an awkward, upright sprint on its hind legs, forelegs tucked against its chest like arms. It plowed straight through the woven wire fence, snapping cedar stays like matchsticks and tearing out the corner brace post with a screech of metal and splintering wood that echoed across the flat ground. My first thought, the only rational thought I could grab onto, was trespasser in a hide, someone trying to scare us or steal stock. People do crazy things for drug money or just pure meanness. We dropped our tools and jumped on the ATVs without discussion. The ground was a mess, mud sucking at the tires, deep ruts from the earlier rain threatening to flip us if we took a turn too fast. The thing cut across open ground at an angle, its run jerky and off balance, almost like it couldn't decide whether to drop to all fours or keep running upright. It moved with disturbing speed, faster than any sheep could manage, faster than most men. It angled for the ravine and slipped down into the shadows where the willows grew thick and the clay banks dropped 8 feet straight down. We stopped short, sliding sideways in the mud, and climbed down into the wash. Wade had his flashlight, and I had my knife, though what good either would do I didn't know. We found nothing but wet clay and a wall of willow roots, water still trickling through the center channel. Upstream, a loose rock tumbled down the bank with a hollow crack, but no movement followed. Just the sound of water and our own breathing, harsh and fast. We stood there for 5 full minutes, sweeping the ravine with the flashlight beam, seeing nothing but shadows and the dark mouths of undercut banks. Back at the fence, we examined where it had gone through. There was wool caught on the barbed wire, dark and matted, but it wasn't the coarse belly wool you'd expect from a sheep forcing through wire. It was cleaner, shorter, almost trimmed, like someone had shorn it and then deliberately stuck it there. In the mud, around the break, were 2 sets of tracks pressed deep into the soft clay. Hoof prints, clean and fresh, with the distinctive split of a sheep's cloven hoof. Right beside them, spaced 2 feet apart in a running stride, were human-sized, barefoot impressions. I knelt down, my knees sinking into the cold mud, and studied them in the failing light. The toes splayed wide, abnormally wide, like fingers spread for balance. Each print sank 3 inches deep into the soft ground, suggesting significant weight hitting its speed. Some had a toe drag on the inside edge, a scraping mark like the person had an old injury or deformity that forced them to compensate with each step. The spacing was wrong too far apart for walking, suggesting either a long stride or something moving at near sprint speed. Wade and I told ourselves it had to be someone messing around, maybe some teenager high on something or a transient trying to survive by killing stock. Still, when we locked the gates and headed out as the sun dropped below the mesa, I noticed the chain on the south entrance was wet again, glistening in the last light. Not wet like rain, but slick, the kind of slick you get from fresh sweat or someone handling it with damp hands. Only problem was it hadn't rained since the storm passed hours earlier, and neither of us had touched that chain. We'd come in through the north gate. That night, back at my trailer, I couldn't settle. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those tracks beside each other, hoof and human, pressed into the same mud, at the same depth, like they'd been made at the same time by the same creature. That wasn't possible. I knew it wasn't possible. But I also knew what I'd seen, and I knew the desert. I'd tracked coyote, bobcat, even mountain lion through this country. I'd seen how animals moved, how they left sign. This was different. This was wrong in a way that made my stomach clench. The next morning, Wade and I were both back at the pens before the sun was fully up, neither of us having slept much. The storm had left the ravine slick, the clay still holding every print from the night before in perfect detail, like a plaster cast. We patched the section where the fence had been blown out with new wire and extra posts, working mostly in silence. Then we started following the wash on foot, moving slowly, studying every inch of disturbed ground. The rain had carved new ledges into the banks and left slick, tan shelves of packed clay that recorded everything that had passed. Not far from the break, maybe 30 yards downstream, we found wool caught on rabbit brush 6 feet up, well above where any sheep could have rubbed against it. The branches were bent outward, not down, like something tall had pushed through, not under. On a flat stretch of mud between 2 bends, the tracks reappeared with startling clarity. Coyote paw prints, small and delicate. Sheep hoof prints, overlapping in places. And the same barefoot impressions from last night, deep and deliberate. They were spaced long, set heel to toe like someone running at speed, pushing hard off the ball of each foot. On one print, the clearest one, the big toe splayed far from the others, almost perpendicular to the foot, as if it had been broken long ago and healed wrong, or as if the foot itself had been restructured by injury or birth defect. Wade crouched down and put his hand next to the print for scale. His hand vanished inside it. We both knew what we were looking at, even if we didn't want to say it out loud. This was a human footprint, or something close enough to human that it didn't matter, and it was out here, in the desert, running through a sheep pen in the middle of the night, breaking through fences with inhuman strength. We drove into Kayenta later that morning for salt blocks and wire, making the trip more for normalcy than necessity. At the trading post, we asked around without giving details, just casual questions about stock losses and strange activity. A couple of ranchers mentioned losing animals earlier in the summer, north toward Shanto. Nothing recovered, no blood trails, just gone. Another man, older, with skin like leather and eyes that didn't blink much, said a place down near Chilchinbito had lost lambs with no blood trail, just drag marks that stopped at the base of a rock face. The lambs were gone, but their wool was found a week later, bundled and left on a fence post like an offering or a warning. Nothing about any of it sounded like coyotes or even feral dogs. Predators don't bundle wool. Predators don't mimic sheep calls. Predators don't wear the skins of what they hunt. When we got back to the pens, Wade's uncle, Lloyd, came by to drop off some supplemental feed. Lloyd was Navajo, raised traditional, and knew more about this land than any government surveyor or university researcher ever would. We told him about the prints, about the wool, about the way the thing moved. He listened without interrupting, his face giving nothing away, then said not to follow anything into a wash after rain, and never to trail sign if it changed from animal to human and back again. His voice was flat, matter of fact, like he was giving advice about checking fence posts or rotating pasture. He left without asking questions, without offering explanations. That scared me more than anything else. That evening, Wade and I decided to watch the pens. We didn't use a campfire and kept the lights off except for the ATVs, which we staged facing the ravine with red filters over the lamps to preserve our night vision. We counted the flock twice, marking each animal, making sure we knew exactly how many we had. 37 ewes, 42 lambs. The night was quiet except for distant thunder rolling over Monument Valley to the north, flashes of lightning that lit up the underside of clouds in shades of purple and gold. Around midnight, a single ewe gave a short, flat bleat from the center of the pen. It wasn't a distress call exactly, more like a question, a sound sheep make when they're trying to locate another member of the flock. A few seconds later, the same sound came from the ravine, drifting up from the darkness below, but it was slightly off, close enough to mimic, close enough to fool a sheep, but missing something essential. The timing was wrong, the pitch slightly too high, like someone imitating a sound they'd heard but didn't fully understand. The flock went dead silent. Every animal stopped moving, stopped chewing, stopped breathing, it seemed. They all faced the ravine, heads up, ears forward. I've worked livestock my entire adult life, and I've never seen that level of unified fear response. Prey animals have instincts honed over millions of years. They know when a predator is close. They know when something is wrong. We turned toward the sound, hands on our flashlights but not turning them on yet, and I caught movement along the fence in my peripheral vision. A shape rose up at the far side, maybe 60 yards away, visible only as a darker shadow against the dark ground. I could see a hand gripping the wire tight, fingers wrapped around the top strand, and I could hear the wire singing under tension. It moved sideways, slow and deliberate, not hopping like sheep do when they clear an obstacle, but sliding laterally like a person moving along a wall in the dark. I started my ATV and the engine's roar split the night. The sound sent the shape dropping to the ground immediately, then loping along the outside of the pen toward the low spot where the bank sloped down. We gave chase, my ATV fishtailing in the mud, Wade right behind me. My light caught it, cresting a small berm, tall, impossibly tall, with narrow shoulders and something draped over its back that looked like rawhide, stitched with patches of wool. The head was wrong, too large or too small. I couldn't tell in the bouncing light. It stumbled, dropped to all fours for 2 strides, moving like a dog, then surged upright again and made for the ravine with terrifying speed. We hit deep clay and bogged the ATVs, the wheels spinning uselessly. We continued on foot until we reached a rock shelf where the ravine cut through sandstone. The tracks changed abruptly. 2 clean right-foot human impressions, pressed so deep you could see the individual toe marks, then a tangle of cloven marks, overlapping, confused, then nothing on the bare rock, as if whatever made them had simply vanished into the stone itself. At first light, we found a lamb downstream, tangled in old barbed wire against a mesquite tree. It was alive, but trembling so violently its legs could barely support its weight. There were no bite marks, no blood, no sign of attack. It looked like it had been carried there and deliberately placed, the wire wrapped around its legs in a way that was almost careful, almost gentle. It stared at nothing, eyes wide and fixed, and wouldn't respond to our touch or our voices. We had to cut it free and carry it back to the pen. It died 3 hours later, just stopped breathing, as if fear itself had killed it. By the 3rd day, we'd stopped trying to convince ourselves it was a prank or a person. The tracks, the lamb, the way it moved, the sounds it made, none of it fit anything harmless or even anything we could name. That morning, Wade and I decided to get serious. We ran a grid along the ravine, tying low tripwires between mesquite trunks and hanging old nails from twine so they'd clatter if anything brushed past. We moved panels to tighten the pen's perimeter and laid heavy cattle mats over the soft spots in the ground where tracks would show. Wade called his Uncle Lloyd back, and I brought my brother Louis, who ran cattle up near Mexican water. Both had worked stock for decades and knew how to read sign better than any sheriff or game warden. Nobody wasted time with stories or guesses. We just worked, each man taking a section to fortify, building layers of defense between the flock and whatever was out there in the dark. By mid-afternoon, Lloyd found something. On a side cut where the ravine undercut a sandstone shelf, hidden behind a screen of tamarisk and Russian thistle, he spotted a patch of sand that looked recently smoothed over, like someone had deliberately erased their tracks. We belly-crawled under the ledge, the rock pressing close above us, and found a shallow alcove carved by ancient water flow. Inside, protected from rain and sun, was clear evidence of habitation. A rolled tarp, military surplus, faded green, 2 old jackets, both torn and stained with dried mud and what might have been blood, an army canteen with water still sloshing inside, a coil of twine, the same gauge as what we used for bailing, and a pocket knife with fresh lanolin smeared along the blade edge, the thick grease sheep secrete in their wool. In one corner was a pile of wool, cut clean at the base with a sharp blade, sorted into neat bundles by length and quality like someone planning to sell it or trade it. At the edge of the sand was a partial footprint, heel and midfoot pressed deep, as if someone had crouched there for a long time, watching, waiting. Beside it was a cloven print in the same wet layer of sand, the same depth, the same age, made at the same time, by the same creature, or person, or whatever it was. We didn't speak. We just photographed everything with our phones, laid a tape measure for scale, and carefully packed the items into clean feed sacks to preserve any evidence. Wade radioed the tribal livestock officer out of Tuba City on the emergency channel. The man told us to preserve the sign, keep our distance, and wait until he could get out in the morning if the roads stayed passable after another storm cell that was building to the west. Lloyd took a shovel from the truck and drew a line in the damp dirt around the pens, circling the flock in a complete, unbroken ring. He told us, without raising his voice, without any dramatics, not to let anyone, especially children, cross that line until sunrise. He salted the base of the fence with coarse rock salt, laying it thick, and set 2 wide snares on the outside, positioned low, enough to catch a leg but not break it. He worked methodically, his hands steady, and I realized he'd done this before. He'd dealt with something like this before. That evening, a small storm cell built to the west, clouds stacking up purple and black against the sunset. By nightfall, the wind was pushing hard enough to make the T-posts strain in their concrete sets, singing like tuning forks. The sheep were pressed together in a tight mass in the center of the pen, refusing to separate, refusing to lie down. Animals know. They always know before we do. Around 10 o'clock, the nails on one of the tripwires clattered once, sharp and clear in the darkness. A few minutes later, one of Lloyd's snares went taut with a metallic snap, jerking the post sideways in the mud with enough force to crack the wood. We swung our lights toward the sound and caught movement just beyond the salt line, at the very edge of our light's reach. A figure standing close to the fence, tall and narrow, maybe 7 feet or more, head turned slightly down as if studying the salt barrier with curiosity or respect. It stepped back slowly, deliberately, keeping outside the salt line like it understood what it meant, like it knew the boundary we'd set and chose not to cross it. The sheep went insane, bleating in panic, trying to climb over each other in their terror. The dogs we'd brought growled low but stayed behind us, their hackles up, refusing to advance. A second later, lightning lit the ravine in a flash of pure white light that turned night into day for one frozen moment. In that flash, I saw it clearly. The figure pivoted and ran, but in that instant of illumination, I saw its face, or what should have been a face. Clay-streaked skin stretched over sharp bones, eyes too wide, reflecting the light like an animal's eyes, a mouth that opened too far, and that rawhide draped over its shoulders, stitched with wool, wet and gleaming. We chased to the lip of the ravine, our lights cutting through the darkness, and saw nothing but shadow and the silver thread of water running through the wash bottom. In the morning, when we checked the snare, the livestock officer found the steel cable kinked in tight, deliberate twists, like it had been turned by hand, methodically, until the metal fatigued and snapped, the kind of strength that would break a man's fingers, the kind of patience that was somehow worse than violence. We decided that night would be the last. The next morning, no matter what happened, no matter what we saw or didn't see, we'd load the entire flock and move them to Wade's cousin's land near Comb Ridge, 30 miles away. We'd already reinforced the weakest corner with new T-posts and a railroad tie salvaged from an old siding, then stacked old metal gates along the outside of the fence so there were no gaps, no spaces wide enough for anything larger than a rat to squeeze through. By sundown, everything that could be done was done. We had 4 men, 2 shotguns, 3 flashlights, and a flare gun Lloyd had brought. We took turns sleeping in 2-hour shifts, but none of us actually slept. We just lay there in the truck bed, staring up at the stars, listening to the night sounds, waiting for something to go wrong. Just after midnight, the nails strung on the tripwires rattled in 3 different spots, simultaneously, north, south, and east. Instead of testing one section, instead of probing for weakness like any animal would, whatever was out there was coordinating, testing multiple points at once with intelligence and planning. We kept the truck lights off to save our night vision and fanned out along the inside of the fence, each man covering a section. The air was damp and heavy with the smell of rain coming, and underneath that, something else. A smell like wet dog mixed with rancid fat and something sweet that made my stomach turn. A hand curled over the top of the fence near where I stood, 6 feet up, the fingers long and the joints pronounced in the dim starlight. Mud streaked the pale skin, and the nails were broken and black with embedded dirt. They gripped the wire tight, testing it, and then pulled back out of sight without a sound. I could hear breathing somewhere past the posts, steady and controlled, like someone doing hard labor but maintaining composure. Lloyd stepped forward to the salt line, his boots stopping exactly at the edge, and spoke in Navajo. I don't speak the language, but I recognized the cadence as a warning, maybe a prayer. He wasn't yelling. He told whoever or whatever was there to leave what wasn't theirs and to stop coming to this place. His voice was low and even, the voice of a man who'd faced fear before and survived it. For a few seconds, nothing moved. Then the fence bowed inward from sudden weight, the metal screeching, the posts groaning. The railroad tie held, barely, concrete cracking at its base. Wade moved toward the gap on the low side and flipped on the floodlight we'd staged there before dark, powered by a portable generator. The wash exploded into white light, so bright it hurt to look at. For a second, maybe less, everything was absolutely clear. The figure at the low spot was tall and skeletal, thin, ribs showing under skin that was smeared with clay and streaked with something darker, shoulders draped with rawhide stitched with patches of wool and a grotesque parody of clothing. The face was human, but wrong. The proportions off, the eyes too wide and catching the light like mirrors, the mouth open in what might have been surprise or rage. It made a sound, high and broken, that could have been a scream or could have been laughter. It bolted, hit Lloyd's second snare, and tore free with a sharp cry that was absolutely, undeniably human pain and fury mixed together. Blood spattered on the ground, dark and thick. The figure vanished into the ravine, moving impossibly fast despite the injury, dropping to all fours for 2 strides, then upright again, then gone into the darkness below. We followed the trail downstream with flashlights and the floodlight on its portable stand, moving slowly, weapons ready. Blood drops on the clay, black in our light, spaced far apart, suggesting speed despite injury. The trail led through the center of the wash, avoiding the banks, staying in the water as if trying to wash away the scent. We followed for 300 yards until the ground turned to flat rock at a place where the ravine widened into a natural amphitheater. The blood drops ended there, vanishing as if the thing had stopped bleeding or had somehow sealed its wound. Boot prints began on the far side of the rock shelf, heading north toward the Utah line. Not barefoot anymore. Boots. Human boots with a defined tread, maybe military surplus, maybe work boots. The stride was long and even, no longer the broken, desperate run. Whoever or whatever it was had regained composure, had put on boots, had become human again, or had chosen to appear that way. We called it then. There was nothing more we could do in the dark, and all of us knew that following that trail further would take us away from the flock, would leave them undefended. We returned to the pens and waited for dawn in silence, weapons across our laps, watching the perimeter. At dawn, the livestock officer arrived with 2 tribal police officers. We gave him everything, the wool bundles, the jackets, the blade, the photographs. We walked him through what had happened, showed him the tracks, the blood, the damaged fence. He listened and took notes and photographed everything, his face professionally neutral. When we finished, he said there had been other calls like this, though not all had left proof. He said the pattern was always the same. Remote sheep operations, storm season, something that moved between human and animal, something that watched before it acted. His advice was simple and direct. Move the flock, change the routine, and whatever it was would move on. There were places in the desert, he said, where people went when they couldn't be people anymore. Places where the boundaries got thin. Places where someone could survive if they were desperate enough and angry enough and broken enough. He didn't say it outright, but the implication was clear. This was a person, or had been a person once, and maybe still was depending on the time of day, or the phase of the moon, or whatever internal cycle governed their transformation. That morning, we loaded all 79 sheep into stock trailers and left. Every animal, every lamb, everything we could catch. No more losses after that. Wade sold the property at the end of the season and moved his operation closer to family land, where there were more people, more lights, more witnesses. The pens sat empty through the fall and winter, fence posts leaning, wire sagging, salt line still visible in the dry dirt. Months later, at the trading post, I heard from a Hopi man I trust that the previous owner of Wade's property had lost half his flock in one night 5 years back. He told people it wasn't coyotes, wasn't dogs, wasn't anything with 4 legs or 2. Nobody believed him then. He sold the land for a quarter of what it was worth and moved to Flagstaff. I don't doubt his story anymore. I've worked plenty of dusk shifts since that week, running stock for other ranchers, fixing fence, doing the hard work that keeps operations running, but never alone, and never near those pens. I drive past that spot sometimes on my way to Shanto, and I always look. The fence is gone now, reclaimed by the desert, posts scattered by wind and time. But the ravine is still there, dark and deep, and sometimes, when the light is just right at sunset, I see movement down in the shadows where the willows grow thick. Whatever we chased that week, whatever wore the skin of sheep and walked on 2 legs and 4, I learned something that I carry with me. When we drew a line in the salt and spoke words of warning, it stopped crossing. It tested, it watched, it waited, but it honored the boundary. That was enough for me to understand that whatever it was, whatever it had become, some small part of it still remembered being human, still understood rules and boundaries and respect, even if everything else had been stripped away by hunger or madness or the simple, brutal calculus of survival in a place that forgives nothing. I don't go looking for explanations anymore. I don't ask questions about what's possible or impossible in the high desert when the storms roll in and the ancient paths open up beneath our feet. I just know that there are places where the old ways still hold power, where lines drawn in salt still mean something, and where some things are better left alone in the darkness where they've chosen to make their home. That's the truth of it. That's all I know. And God help me, that's all I ever want to know. I went up to Max Patch for one easy night and a sky full of stars. Nothing complicated. I topped off the tank in Hot Springs, North Carolina, grabbed a bottle of water and some chips, and told the cashier where I was headed. He leaned across the counter, his face suddenly serious beneath the fluorescent lights. "Don't stay on the bald after midnight," he said, his voice dropping low enough that I had to lean in. "Things walk up there that shouldn't." He used the word skinwalker, and I filed it with tall tales and campfire talk, the kind of story locals tell to unsettled tourists. The plan was simple: hike the loop, sleep high, leave early. I took I-40 to the Harmon Den exit and crawled the gravel of Max Patch Road until the woods opened and the parking lot appeared. My hiking partner, a friend named Greg from college, sat in the passenger seat checking his phone one last time before we lost signal. The air was cool when we stepped out, carrying that particular mountain crispness that makes your lungs feel clean. The sky was clear enough to trace plains sliding east and a rising moon that would make a headlamp optional once it climbed. I signed the trail register at the board, noting only 3 other names from earlier in the day. I cinched my pack, feeling the familiar weight settle across my shoulders, and stepped out onto the mowed path that rings the bald. Open ground in every direction. No cover, no tricks, just grass and sky and the kind of exposure that feels liberating in daylight. Golden hour makes that hill look soft. It isn't, but the grass takes the light in a way that makes you underestimate how exposed you are. The Appalachian Trail cuts north-south across the crown, with a short blue-blazed spur dropping to the lot. I picked a spot just off the loop, 20 paces from the A.T. sign, and set the tent low because of the wind. The nylon rippled and snapped as we staked it down, each gust reminding us there was nothing between us and weather for miles in any direction. Greg and I ate fast and kept our trash tight, stuffing wrappers deep into a bear bag we'd hang later. A pair of headlamps bobbed on the south side where another group had settled, their voices reaching us in fragments across the open field. Somewhere toward Brown Gap, coyotes called back and forth. The sound was harmless from that distance, almost musical in its rhythm. It just confirmed we weren't alone on the mountain in the strict sense. Nothing strange yet, just the mild tension of being on a wide-open hilltop with everything visible and no good place to disappear if you wanted to. The temperature dropped as the sun touched the ridgeline. I pulled on a fleece and sat on my sleeping pad, watching the light drain from the grass. That's when the feeling started, subtle at first. The sensation of being observed, not the casual awareness of other campers, but something more focused, more patient. I told myself it was the openness playing tricks, the way exposure makes you hypersensitive to movement. I saw the figure when I stood to stretch. It was at the far edge of the field, perhaps 200 yards away, a dark cutout against the sky where the grass gives way to slope. I thought it was a post or trail marker until it shifted one shoulder. It didn't sway in the wind the way a person unconsciously does when standing still. It held so still I felt it before I understood it, the way you sense a spider on the wall before you actually see it. I lifted my headlamp and gave a quick blink, not to blind anyone, just to find out if they'd wave back or call out. Standard trail courtesy. The beam touched a pale oval where a face would be, but the distance made details impossible. What happened next made my stomach clench. The figure dropped to all fours in one smooth motion, like someone who'd practiced the movement 1,000 times, and slipped over the crest. No stumble, no scramble, no human awkwardness, just a controlled vanish that left no sound behind. Did you see that? Greg was standing now, his hand frozen halfway to his water bottle. We looked at each other and ran through the normal options. Prank, animal, hiker, messing around. But none of those fit how it moved. The speed was wrong, the fluidity was wrong. Most of all, the silence was wrong. We told ourselves it was a person keeping low out of the wind, maybe someone who'd smoked too much and was being weird. That explanation didn't make sense, but it was easier than the alternatives. We needed it to make sense, so we forced it to. Night arrived clean and quick. The moon rose to a point where the whole bald turned silver and shadows went sharp, each blade of grass casting its own thin line of darkness. Greg walked up the path about 50 yards to get a clearer look at the Milky Way, his silhouette small against the vast dome of stars. I stayed by the tent, tightening a strap that didn't need tightening, thinking about the long drive home in the morning and whether I'd stop for coffee in Hot Springs. When I swept my headlamp across the slope out of habit, something rose from the grass where the hill breaks. My breath caught. It stood too tall by a little, maybe 6.5 feet, and bent at the knees in a way I still can't diagram with normal anatomy. The joints seemed to hinge at the wrong angles, as if the bones inside didn't follow the standard human blueprint. The arms were long, hanging past where the hips should be. The shoulders were narrow, almost delicate, but the posture suggested strength held in check. The face looked thin and pulled tight over hard angles, the cheekbones too prominent, the jaw too narrow. The eyes reflected flat white in the light, like a deer's, but without the liquid depth. No hint of color, no blink, no biological response to the sudden brightness. It was 10 feet away, well inside the cone of my lamp, close enough to show details I wish I hadn't seen, close enough that I could see its chest wasn't moving with breath. It spoke in Greg's voice, the timbre and rhythm perfect. "You're fine. Keep watching." I spun toward the path, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. Greg was still behind me, 30 yards back, hands in his pockets, his face confused. "What?" he called. He'd heard it too, same words, same cadence. The sound didn't come from him. It came from the thing standing 10 feet away, wearing his voice like a stolen coat. I shut off the lamp, my thumb fumbling with the switch. In the moonlight, it was still there, a clear silhouette that didn't melt into the background once the beam was gone. Moonlight is supposed to soften things, blur edges, make identification difficult. Not this time. The figure remained crisp and defined, as if lit by stage lights. It tilted its head past what a neck should allow, rotating at least 45 degrees beyond normal range, and held it there, as if measuring an angle or studying a specimen. "Are you okay?" Greg called out, the standard hiker question for someone acting strange. "Do you need help?" It didn't answer. It took one step forward, the movement deliberate and measured, and then stopped in a stance I now think of as a test. Feet planted, weight balanced, ready to move in any direction. It wanted to see if we would break first, if we would run, or yell, or do something that would give it permission to change the rules. Every time I glanced down to adjust a strap or check my footing, I heard grass compress, a soft whisper of blades bending. Then when I looked up, it had covered another 2 or 3 yards. It never crossed a line while we watched it directly. It waited for small windows, a blink, a head turn, a moment of distraction, and took them with the efficiency of something that had done this many times before. The air seemed thicker now, harder to pull into my lungs. My hands trembled as I reached for the tent poles. Not from cold, but from the kind of fear that starts in your gut and spreads outward until even your fingertips feel weak. Greg had moved back toward me without my noticing, his footsteps quick and light. "We need to leave," he said, his voice steady but strained. "Right now." We packed up the way you do when you can't afford to be meticulous. Sleeping bags shoved into stuff sacks without rolling them properly, poles half folded and held together with shaking fingers, tent bundled in a lumpy roll and lashed outside the pack with whatever cord came to hand first. My hands shook in a way I usually hide, but there wasn't time for pride or pretense. While we worked, it kept a 30-foot gap, pacing left when we shifted right, matching our speed in a way that felt practiced. There was no brush up there to blame for losing sight lines, no trees or rocks to create confusion. If we saw it, it saw us. If we moved, it adjusted. The grass was too short to hide anything, the moonlight too bright to claim shadows. This was happening in full view, witnessed and undeniable. It didn't lunge, didn't growl, didn't do any of the dramatic things you might expect from horror movies or campfire stories. It acted as if closing the distance wasn't the point. Staying even with us was, maintaining that exact gap, that precise radius of 30 feet, as if we were connected by an invisible tether it refused to break. We began the push to the tree line that marks the spur to the lot. Walking backward on a bald is miserable, your boots catching on hidden dips and rises you can't see. But we did it in short bursts, switching off who faced downhill so one of us always had eyes forward and one had eyes on the crest. The thing never shifted to the side to circle or flank. It kept that set distance as if a tape measure connected us, as if it was following rules we didn't understand but couldn't ignore. When we stopped to adjust our packs, it stopped. When we picked up speed, stumbling over the rough ground, it slipped into a low gallop that looked practiced, controlled, and profoundly wrong. The stride was too long. The rhythm was too smooth. Four-legged motion on a body that was clearly built for two legs, yet it moved without hesitation or awkwardness. The worst part wasn't the shape or the motion. It was the silence. You could hear our boots scuff against stone, the stove clatter against my pack, the heavy breathing of two people pushing hard downhill in the dark. You could hear the wind in the grass and an occasional shout from the other campers far off near Brown Gap. From it, nothing. Not breath, not impact, not the rustle of grass under its weight, just the fact of its body moving where we could see it, covering ground in utter silence. The first glow from the parking area came into view, just a wash of light from a single car's dome light, and the pale beam of someone unlocking a door. That thin boundary of artificial light painted a line across the grass. The thing stopped at that line like a driver braking before a curb. It wasn't fear or hesitation. It didn't flinch or recoil. It just chose not to cross, as if the light represented a rule it acknowledged. I took 2 steps down onto the gravel, my boots crunching loud after the muffled sound of grass. I turned, unable to help myself, and saw it still there, upright again, head turned a fraction too far to the side, watching us with those flat white eyes. "Don't run," Greg said, his voice tight. "Just walk." We didn't run. We walked in stiff, measured paces, every muscle screaming to bolt, until our boots hit gravel and the lot opened around us with the shapes of cars, the trailhead sign, and the profound relief that comes with objects you can name and touch. 2 night hikers had just pulled in, a man and a woman in trail runners with a grocery bag of snacks and water bottles visible through their windshield. Their doors were open, the interior chimes sounding their patient electronic melody. They started to say hello, probably ready to ask about trail conditions or where we'd camped. Then they followed our eyes back up to the bald. We all saw it at once. No trees to confuse the view, no brush to hide in, no darkness to blame. Just a tall, thin shape standing in the open field, angled wrong at the knees, arms loose at its sides, head cocked farther than is useful for any normal purpose. The moon made the outline neat and clear. There was no argument about whether it was there or not. No debate about shadows or imagination. 4 people, 4 sets of eyes, 1 figure. The woman's face went pale. "What is it doing?" The man said something else that I don't remember, his voice rising in pitch. We didn't move. We didn't try to be brave or rational. We just stood together in the lot with the car light behind us and watched. It pivoted without hurry, dropped to all fours with that same fluid wrongness, and ran back across the bald toward the crown. The stride was long and efficient, eating up ground faster than seemed possible. It covered 200 yards in maybe 15 seconds, and then it was a moving dot against the highest point, and then it slipped over the far side toward where the AT runs north into Tennessee. The lot felt smaller after that, as if the only safe space was the rectangle of gravel under our feet. The woman had been leaving a voice message through the car's hands-free system as they pulled in, something about running late. She hit stop and looked down at the screen like a person facing bad news. Her hand shook as she navigated to the recording. "I'm going to play this back," she said, "just to be sure." She replayed the last seconds with the car speakers turned low. You could hear our boots crunch on gravel and the door chime, and then my voice, clear and distinct. "I'm fine." I hadn't said those words. I'd been gasping, trying to catch my breath, silent except for the sound of air moving in and out of my lungs. We compared what each of us heard in the moment and how it didn't line up with what the recording captured. That was the detail none of us liked talking about later. The thing could mimic voices well enough to fool a microphone, well enough to create sound waves that registered on digital recording equipment. We called the non-emergency line for the Madison County Sheriff's Office from the lot. A deputy met us at the trailhead sign 20 minutes later, his cruiser's headlights bright and reassuring against the darkness. He was tired in the way that comes from long nights and short patience for stories that end with, maybe it was a person. He took our names, wrote up an incident number on a card, and told us to camp lower if we planned to stay out late. He didn't laugh and he didn't roll his eyes. He just kept his pen moving, filling in boxes on a form he'd probably filled out before. We gave him the time window and the rough positions on the loop, where we set up, where it stood, where it stopped when the car light touched the grass. He asked if we had pictures. We didn't. Who thinks to photograph something when your body is screaming at you to run? He asked if anyone had been drinking. We hadn't. He told the new arrivals they might want to come back in the morning if they weren't set on a night hike. They left without arguing. I drove home with Greg in silence until the interstate, neither of us wanting to talk about what we'd seen until there was distance and locked doors between us and Max Patch. We didn't play music. The radio chatter felt like it would break whatever thin layer was keeping the night separate from the car, the terror contained in that one place instead of following us home. Back in town, I wrote the account with only the parts I could defend. The arrival, the figure on the skyline, the movement on all fours, the 30-foot pacing, the hard stop at the light from the lot. I posted the incident number and a simple diagram of the bald with an X where we stood and another X where it stood. I didn't add theories. I didn't call it anything specific. I used the word skinwalker once because the cashier had, and because it helped set the frame for what we ignored until we couldn't. A day later, the hikers emailed the audio clip from their car's system. The timestamp lined up with the moment it spoke in Greg's voice on the hill, and then later when it used mine in the parking lot. "You can hear me breathe hard," and the chime ping, and then the sentence I don't remember saying, in my voice, with my inflection. We kept that file between the four of us and the deputy. We didn't post it. We didn't try to clean it up or enhance it. We didn't ask strangers on the internet to analyze it or explain it. It serves one purpose for me. It confirms that the line between what you hear and what is actually said can be crossed by something that chooses to cross it. Something that understands voices well enough to replicate them perfectly, down to the smallest vocal quirk. Here's the part that matters if you hike there. Max Patch is beautiful in the day. Go early, bring a jacket, take the loop, enjoy the view, count the mountain ranges stretching to the horizon. Let the wind clear your head, but when the sun drops and the grass turns the color of steel and the lot light starts to wash a weak boundary across the first rows of blades, you should be off the crown and headed down. I still visit. I eat a sandwich on the summit, count the ranges, and let the wind work its usual magic. I leave before dark. I don't test the edge where the open field meets the first glow of parked cars. I don't give anything up there a chance to measure the distance between us again. I don't wait around to see if it remembers my voice, or if it's learned new ones since. If you ignore that and decide to spend a night on the bald, don't say nobody warned you. I can tell you what we saw, where we stood, the angle of its head, the distance it kept, and the exact place where it stopped, as if the light from a single car drew a line it wouldn't cross. I can hand you the incident number. I can point at the trail register and the spur and the sign. I can show you the audio file if you really want to hear it, though I don't recommend it. You can go prove me wrong in person, or you can keep it simple. Watch the stars from lower ground and let the top of Max Patch belong to whatever holds it after midnight. The hill won't argue. It doesn't need to. The open field says enough without a sound, and what walks there at night doesn't need to explain itself to anyone. It just waits, patient and silent, for the next person who thinks the rules don't apply to them. I learned mine. I hope you learn yours before you have to. I picked a quiet weekday in late October 2017 because I figured the Hall of Mosses would be slow and I could get in and out before dinner in Forks. The weather forecast promised mid-50 seconds and damp conditions with low cloud cover, perfect hiking weather for someone who wanted solitude. At 32 years old, I'd spent enough time on trails to know that weekday afternoons were my sweet spot for avoiding crowds and finding the kind of peace that only comes from walking alone through ancient trees. In the visitor center, a ranger with graying temples and tired eyes answered a couple of my questions about elk migration patterns. His responses were professional and helpful, the kind of practiced information delivery you'd expect from someone who'd spent decades explaining the same ecosystem to thousands of visitors. But then, as I turned to leave, he added something that made me pause. His tone shifted slightly, became more casual, almost conspiratorial. If something copies your voice out there, don't answer it. I smiled because it sounded like park humor meant to stick in your head while you're out there, the kind of half-joke rangers tell to keep people alert without actually scaring them away. I'd only ever heard that word skinwalker tied to desert landscapes in the Southwest, places I don't live near and have never visited. Temperate rainforest wasn't what I pictured when I'd read about that folklore online during late-night internet rabbit holes. I wanted a short walk on a famous loop trail. That was it. Nothing ambitious, nothing challenging, just a peaceful hour among the moss-draped trees before heading back to Seattle the next morning. The boardwalk was wet but grippy, the treated wood darkened by moisture but still providing solid traction. The trail climbs a little at first, then levels out, and gradually the sound of the Hoh River becomes more of a distant hush than the roar you hear from the parking area. You can hear steady drips coming off the moss without needing to pretend the forest is doing anything supernatural or mysterious. It's just water condensing and falling, the basic physics of a rainforest ecosystem. I let a pair of hikers pass me early on, a couple in their 50s with expensive gear and the kind of comfortable silence that comes from years of hiking together. I stepped back onto the planks after they rounded a bend and kept a comfortable pace. My boots made soft thuds on the boardwalk, a rhythmic sound that helped me settle into the meditative state I'd come here for. The loop had people behind me I could hear, distant voices and occasional laughter, but I didn't see anyone ahead. It felt calm in the way a weekday afternoon often does out there, which was exactly what I wanted. No crowds, no need to make small talk, just me and the ancient forest doing what it had done for centuries. I noticed the handprints about 10 minutes into the walk. There's a thin green film on the handrail where people don't touch as much, a layer of algae or moss that builds up in the constantly damp environment. In that film were clean ovals, places where a hand had pressed down and slid a little, wiping away the growth. 4 long finger marks, a narrow palm, then a gap of a few feet, and the same pattern repeated. The spacing was wrong. That's what caught my attention first, before I even consciously registered what I was seeing. The prints were too far apart for a normal walking pace along a handrail. Someone would have had to reach, or move in an awkward shuffling gait, or... I put my hand next to one for a point of reference. My palm looked blunt by comparison, my fingers shorter and thicker. Whoever made those prints had long, narrow fingers and had put their weight straight down into the rail with considerable force. The clarity of the prints suggested they were recent. The film hadn't had time to regrow. At a corner where the boardwalk turned sharply to follow the terrain, the handprint stopped. Instead, there was a faint scuff mark on the outside edge of the rail, right on top of the rounded surface, as if a foot had stepped onto it instead of around it. The mark was elongated, showing a sliding motion. I told myself someone had tried to do a stupid balance trick and bailed. It's a national park. People do dumb things for social media all the time. I'd seen plenty of evidence of that over the years: carved initials, trash left behind, damage to fragile ecosystems from people stepping off designated paths. This was probably just another example of careless behavior. I took a few more steps forward, already starting to forget about the prints, and from up the trail, not far ahead, maybe 30 feet around the next bend, I heard my name in my brother's voice. His normal tone, the exact cadence and pitch he uses to get my attention without making a scene. There were no other words attached to it. It wasn't loud or urgent. It sounded precisely like he was standing just out of sight around that curve, waiting for me to catch up. My brother wasn't there. He lives in Colorado and had no idea I was in Washington. We hadn't spoken in 2 weeks, and our last conversation had been a brief text exchange about our mother's birthday plans. The sound made me stop moving because there's no mistaking that tone if you've heard it 1,000 times growing up, sharing rooms, sharing space, sharing a lifetime of casual communication. I looked at the empty bend ahead, thought about the ranger's joke at the visitor center, and decided right then that I wasn't answering anything. I wasn't stepping off the boardwalk. I wasn't speeding up to investigate or chase whatever that was. My heart rate had increased noticeably, and I could feel the change in my breathing, shorter, shallower breaths that I had to consciously deepen. I took another deliberate breath, filling my lungs completely, and kept moving forward at the same steady pace. Running would be stupid. Calling out would be stupider. The big nurse log came into view after the next gentle curve. It's one of those massive fallen trees, maybe 8 feet in diameter, with younger hemlocks and small ferns growing along its entire length, feeding on the nutrients from the decomposing wood. The log is featured in half the photographs tourists take on this trail, a perfect example of forest regeneration. Perched on the moss, covering the log, was a shape that registered as a person for maybe half a second, and then absolutely didn't. It was too lean through the torso, the proportions all wrong in subtle ways that my brain struggled to process. The elbows were pulled back in a way I can only describe as held for control, like someone consciously maintaining an uncomfortable position. The feet were flexed at an angle I couldn't match in my head. The ankles didn't line up properly with the angle of the shins. Its chin lifted slightly as I approached, and the mouth opened farther than I expected. I didn't see teeth clearly, just dark gums and a wet interior that seemed too wide for the face shape. The opening wasn't like someone preparing to speak or yawn. It was wider, more vertical, wrong in a way that made my stomach clench. It didn't blink. I watched for several seconds, and there was no blink reflex at all. I didn't see it breathe either. No rise and fall of the chest, no movement of the shoulders or rib cage. It watched me as if waiting for me to be the one to break, to run, to scream, to do something that would trigger whatever came next in this encounter. I didn't run. I counted in my head to 5, a focusing technique I'd learned years ago to manage stress. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It stayed perfectly still, maintaining eye contact the entire time. I shifted my weight backward carefully and slid my shoe on the board so it wouldn't squeak or make any sudden noise. When I'd put maybe 10 feet of distance between us, moving in slow backward steps while keeping my eyes on it, the figure dropped off the log in a vertical motion that didn't match the way any person would climb down from a raised surface. It simply released and descended straight down, like something with completely different joint mechanics. I didn't hear it land over the constant dripping of water from the canopy above. It wasn't trying to hide its presence. It was just there on the log, and then down on the ground, and the shape of it standing among the ferns looked tall and somehow flat, difficult to track properly in my peripheral vision. The proportions kept confusing my eyes, making it hard to maintain a clear sense of where it was in space. I adjusted my plan to something simple and actionable. Do not leave the boardwalk under any circumstances. Keep it in front of me where I could see it clearly, or off to the side within my field of vision, and back out in a straight line if necessary. No complex decisions, no weighing options, just clear rules I could follow even if panic started to set in. I started a slow retreat, walking backward while maintaining visual contact. When I sped up my steps, it sped up, moving through the undergrowth at exactly the same pace. When I slowed down to test the pattern, it slowed down to match. It never crossed onto the boardwalk or even approached the wooden structure. Instead, it moved through the understory in a line that kept it parallel to my position, with ferns and small hemlock saplings between us. When I looked to the right, making quick glances to check its position, it was already looking back at me. It didn't duck behind trees or make any attempt to hide. It didn't posture aggressively or show teeth in a threat display. It just matched my pace without making a sound I could catch over the ambient forest noise. The absence of footsteps, of breathing, of any normal sound of movement made everything worse than if it had been crashing through the brush or making obvious threatening gestures. I forced myself to say normal things out loud, breaking the silence with my own voice. Slickboard here. Watch your step. Moss is thick on this section. Meaningless observations. A running commentary on trail conditions. Because the ranger's joke about copied voices lived in my head, rent-free now, and I wanted my own voice to be the only one present, the only one I might be tempted to respond to. My throat felt tight. My voice sounded strained, even to my own ears, but I kept talking. Two hikers appeared ahead of me on the trail, a woman in a blue rain jacket and a man with a small gray day pack. Relief flooded through me at the sight of other people, witnesses, company, safety in numbers. I didn't try to act casual because I didn't have the energy for performance. My face must have shown exactly how I felt. "Can you walk with me, please?" The words came out more urgent than I intended. They saw my expression and didn't argue or ask questions. The woman's eyes widened, and the man immediately looked around, assessing the situation. I pointed to the right, not entirely sure what they'd see through all that dense green vegetation in the low light under the thick canopy. All three of us watched as the figure stepped behind a wide trunk and then leaned out, just the head and one shoulder visible. In that lean, for a split second, the profile lined up with the woman's facial features in a way that made her gasp sharply and clamp her hand over her mouth to stifle any sound. The man said, "Oh God," in a choked whisper, and that was it. No one tried to communicate with it. No one challenged it or demanded to know what it was doing. We stood there breathing hard for a long 3 seconds that felt like minutes, and then the three of us moved together at a steady pace toward the trailhead. We kept a formation without explicitly planning it, some instinct for group safety taking over. I took the middle position. The woman took the front because she said she wanted to know what was coming, needed to see the path ahead. The guy took the rear because he didn't want it behind him where he couldn't monitor its position. We talked on purpose about basic, mundane things, where we'd parked our cars, whether the rain would start before we got back, how far it was to the parking lot. Normal conversation, ordinary words, because the familiar cadence kept us moving forward instead of freezing up or panicking. The thing never rushed us. It never fell behind or lost interest. It never tried to flank our group or cut us off. It just stayed even with us, matching our pace exactly, maintaining the same distance, stepping from one section of undergrowth to the next as we progressed along each stretch of boardwalk. Every time I let my eyes drift off the planks and into the ferns, it was already there, framed by a gap in the vegetation, shoulders angled toward us, head turned as if we were the only objects of interest in its entire world. The more I tried to study it, to understand what I was seeing, the more wrong the feet looked. The contact points with the ground didn't match the physics of weight distribution, and I hated that my brain kept trying to solve the mechanical impossibility instead of just accepting the danger and focusing on escape. We passed another stretch of handrail with green film and found a fresh line of those long handprints again, spaced out like someone had crawled or pulled themselves along while we were farther up the trail. The guy muttered that kids do weird stuff for videos these days, and I desperately wanted to believe that explanation, but the prints were too fresh and too clean and too far apart for someone fooling around and hopping on and off repeatedly. We didn't stop to examine them. We just noted their presence and kept moving, maintaining our pace and our formation. Every time I checked to the right, the shape was there. Same distance, same angle, never crossing onto the boards. The last stretch of trail opens up a little, and you can see the information kiosk through the trees. A car turned into the parking lot while we were still under the canopy, and the headlights swept across the first line of trunks beyond the road, illuminating the forest edge. In that wash of light, the figure was fully upright and visible in a way it hadn't been under the shadows. Tall, impossibly thin, arms hanging at its sides, facing us directly. It wasn't crouched or bent or trying to use the terrain for cover. It stood there like a person stands when they've decided to be seen, to be acknowledged, to make their presence completely clear. When the headlight beam moved off and darkness returned to that section of forest, it stepped backward without turning around and was gone into the shade. Not running, not hurrying, just a smooth, controlled step back into all the visual clutter that blocks clear sight lines and makes depth perception nearly impossible in a dense rainforest. We walked straight into the visitor center. My hands were shaking slightly as I approached the desk. I didn't try to sanitize what I'd experienced or make it sound less strange. I said there was a suspicious person pacing us from off the trail, that they had matched our speed for several minutes. I said they were thin, moved silently, and seemed focused on us. I emphasized that we never left the boardwalk, never engaged, just kept moving toward safety. The couple backed me up without embellishing, describing exactly what they'd seen. The ranger on duty listened carefully, took detailed notes, wrote down the time and weather conditions, and marked the specific locations we described on a simple map of the loop trail. Another staff member grabbed a flashlight, and the two of them walked the first stretch of the trail, while we stood by the kiosk trying to slow our breathing and process what had happened. When they returned about 20 minutes later, they asked for our names and phone numbers. The incident report they filed, which I later learned about when I called for a follow-up, was categorized as suspicious person, possible wildlife harassment, safety patrol requested. It felt validating to have it officially documented, not because I wanted attention or drama, but because it meant I hadn't imagined a basic sequence of events. 3 people had witnessed something, and it was now part of the park's records. I drove back toward Forks as darkness fell, realizing how quickly the forest turns completely dark under that thick canopy in late October. You don't feel the sun gradually setting, it just gets dim, then very dim, and then you're in your car with the heater running, looking at a solid wall of evergreens across the river that doesn't reveal anything past the first row of trunks. When I called the park office the next afternoon because I couldn't stop replaying the handprints and the way it had dropped off the log, the person who answered said a law enforcement ranger had walked a complete sweep of the trail. Before closing time, they didn't find anyone on the trail or in the immediate area, but they had observed algae smears on sections of the handrail near where I'd described them, and a scuff mark on the outside edge of a corner rail, consistent with someone stepping onto the top surface. They added my follow-up information to the incident report and assured me they track patterns of unusual activity. I appreciated that response more than I expected to. It meant they took it seriously, that there was a system for monitoring these things. I went back to the Hall of Mosses months later, in March 2018, but only in full daylight and with company. 2 friends were visiting from Portland and wanted to see the famous moss-draped trees and the impressive nurse logs. We ran the loop clockwise at noon under bright cloud cover that provided excellent visibility. It was what most people get to experience out there, families taking photos, a couple of Roosevelt elk grazing in the river flats, children counting banana slugs on the boardwalk, exactly like the postcard version of the Pacific Northwest. I showed them the specific nurse log where I'd stopped and counted to 5 in my head. Without fog and with better light, it was just a log with small trees growing on top and a thick coating of green moss. No mystery, no anomaly, no handprints on the rails. The place looked exactly like every tourist photograph and every video clip shared online. We kept moving at a relaxed pace, took a few breaks on the wooden benches placed along the route, and finished the loop without any unusual incidents or stories to tell, except that one person in our group had a documented reason to keep his voice steady and his eyes moving. Back at the visitor center, I wrote a brief follow-up statement and asked them to attach it to my original incident number, so whoever reviews reports later has access to all the details, which direction I was walking, what I observed, where I turned around, the timeline of events. I didn't ask for them to change how they interact with visitors or modify their standard information about trail safety. But if someone were taking bets, I'd put serious money on the fact that the joke about copied voices didn't originate from nowhere. It's a warning that sticks in your memory because it needs to, because something about this place requires that specific caution. If you go to the Hall of Mosses, remember the simplest and most important rule. Stay on the boardwalk. Don't let anything coax you off the designated trail. If you hear your name in a voice that shouldn't be in that forest on a quiet weekday afternoon, keep walking. Find other people and use your own words to fill the silence. Report what you saw to the rangers and let them document it and do their jobs. I still hike in the Hoh rainforest. I go with company and during the middle of the day, and I always leave before the light starts dropping. I don't need absolute proof or scientific explanation to make that choice. I just need the memory of that feeling in my chest when the headlights swept across the trees and that tall, thin shape stood perfectly still and then stepped backward into the shadows. To the thing that matched my pace under the hemlocks and briefly wore a face that wasn't its own, let's not meet again.